Hello, travelers of the night, and welcome back to Midnight Lullaby. These stories drift through the static, a signal that drowns out the noise of the waking world and guides you into slumber. Before the signal slips away, leave a trace. Tell me which part of the world you're listening from, so I know how far this broadcast reaches. And if the whispers keep you company, a like and a subscribe help keep the transmission alive. Now, close your eyes, relax. The broadcast begins. The floorboards whisper beneath my bare feet as I pad through the hallway, drawn by something I cannot name. The house breathes around me. Old wood settling, pipes sighing in the walls like sleeping children. It's past 2 a.m, and the darkness feels thick, almost tangible against my skin. I wasn't planning to leave my bed. Sleep had been pulling me under when I heard it. The soft scrape of a chair against linoleum, the gentle percussion of footsteps on tile. Kitchen sounds. Normal sounds, really, except for the small detail that I live alone. The hallway stretches longer than I remember, it being during daylight hours. My fingertips brush against the cool wall as I move forward, counting my steps. 1, 2, 3. 15 steps from bedroom to kitchen threshold. I've walked this path 1,000 times, but tonight each footfall seems to echo in places that shouldn't exist. The kitchen doorway appears before me, a rectangle of deeper shadow framed in the ambient darkness. I pause here, listening. The refrigerator hums its familiar lullaby. The clock above the sink ticks with mechanical precision. But underneath these ordinary sounds, I detect something else. The whisper of fabric against skin, the soft exhalation of breath that isn't mine. I step into the kitchen. The moonlight filters through the window above the sink, casting everything in silver and shadow. The chairs around my small dining table sit in their usual positions, pushed neatly beneath the wooden surface. The counters are clean, empty except for the coffee maker and a bowl of fruit that looks almost luminous in the pale light. Nothing is out of place. Nothing moves. But the sensation persists, that feeling of presence, of being observed. The air itself seems charged, as if someone has just passed through this space moments before my arrival. I can almost smell it, a faint perfume that doesn't belong. Something floral and old-fashioned, like roses pressed between the pages of a forgotten book. I move toward the sink. My footsteps unnaturally loud in the silence. The faucet gleams in the moonlight, a silver curve that catches and holds my attention. As I reach for it, my reflection wavers in the chrome surface, distorted and strange. For just a moment, I see 2 faces looking back at me. Mine and something else. Something that smiles when I don't. I jerk my hand back, and the reflection normalizes. Just me, pale and tired, looking in the dim light. My heart pounds against my ribs like a caged bird, but I force myself to breathe slowly, evenly. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Count to 10. The rational part of my mind catalogues explanations, stress from work, too much caffeine, the way shadows can play tricks in limited light. Houses make noises. That's what old houses do. They settle and shift and creak, especially at night when the temperature drops and the wood contracts. There's nothing supernatural about thermal expansion. I turn on the tap, cupping cold water in my palms and splashing it against my face. The shock of it helps clear my head. It grounds me in the physical reality of water droplets running down my cheeks. The porcelain edge of the sink pressing against my stomach as I lean forward. That's when I hear it again. The scrape of a chair. I freeze, water still dripping from my chin. The sound came from directly behind me. The unmistakable drag of wood against linoleum as someone pulls out a seat at my dining table. Slow, deliberate, the way someone might sit down for a late-night conversation. I don't turn around immediately. I can't. My muscles have locked in place. Every nerve ending suddenly hyper-aware. The water from the faucet continues to flow, a steady stream that sounds impossibly loud in my ears. I focus on that sound, use it as an anchor while my mind tries to process what I've heard. Someone is in my kitchen. Someone has pulled out a chair and is sitting at my table. I can feel eyes on the back of my neck, patient and watchful, waiting for me to acknowledge what I already know. I turn off the faucet. The silence that follows feels absolute, pressing against my eardrums like cotton. And in that silence, I hear breathing that isn't mine. Slow, measured, almost meditative. The kind of breathing that belongs to someone perfectly at ease, someone who has every right to be here. I turn around. The chairs are all pushed in, exactly as they were before. The table sits empty in the moonlight, its surface clean and uncluttered. No one is there. No one has ever been there, but the air still holds that faint perfume, stronger now. Roses and something else, something earthier, more complex. And on the chair closest to me, the one I could swear I heard being pulled out, there's a slight indentation in the cushion, as if someone has just risen from it. I approach the table slowly, each step a negotiation between fear and curiosity. The indentation is subtle but unmistakable, a depression in the fabric that matches the shape of someone sitting. I reach out to touch it, and the material is warm beneath my fingers. Body warm. Who's there? I whisper to the empty kitchen. My voice sounds strange, smaller than it should be. It seems to disappear into the shadows without echo, absorbed by the darkness that presses in from every corner. No answer comes. But as I stand there with my hand on the warm cushion, I notice something else. The bowl of fruit on the counter. The apples and oranges I arranged there just yesterday has changed. One apple is missing from the arrangement, leaving a gap like a missing tooth. And beside the bowl, I can see the ghost of moisture rings on the wooden surface, as if glasses have been set down there recently. Multiple glasses arranged in a neat row. But I live alone. I've lived alone in this house for 3 years, ever since the divorce. I know every sound it makes, every shadow it casts. I know where each piece of furniture belongs and how the light falls at different times of day. This is my space, my sanctuary. So why does it feel like I'm the intruder here? I back away from the table, my eyes scanning the kitchen for other signs of disturbance. Everything appears normal, but normal has taken on a different quality now. The familiar has become foreign, infected with the possibility that nothing is quite what it seems. The clock above the sink reads 2:47 a.m. Time feels elastic here in the darkness, stretching and contracting in ways that make me question how long I've actually been standing in this kitchen. It feels like hours, but it could have been minutes or seconds. I should go back to bed. I should chalk this up to stress and fatigue, and the way the mind can conjure presences from shadows and silence. I should turn around and walk back down that hallway, slip between my sheets, and wait for dawn to restore the world to its proper proportions. But I don't move. Because as I stand here in my moonlit kitchen, surrounded by the familiar objects of my daily life, I'm beginning to understand something that makes my skin crawl with recognition. This isn't the first time. The memories come flooding back. Other nights, other moments of waking to sounds that shouldn't exist. The feeling of being watched while I cook dinner. The sensation of someone else's presence when I sit at this very table with my morning coffee. How many times have I dismissed these feelings as imagination? How many times have I convinced myself that living alone means being alone? The perfume grows stronger, and I realize with mounting dread that I recognize it. It's the same scent my grandmother wore, the one she kept in a cut glass bottle on her vanity table. She died when I was 12, but I remember that smell perfectly. Roses and powder, and something indefinably sweet. But my grandmother never lived in this house. She never sat at this table or walked through this kitchen. Her presence here makes no sense, defies every rational explanation I can construct. Unless I'm not who I think I am. The thought strikes me with such force that I have to grip the edge of the counter to steady myself. What if the memories I carry aren't mine? What if this house, this life, this identity I've built for myself is just another kind of dream? I close my eyes and try to remember the details of my existence, my name, my job, the series of choices that led me to this moment. But the details feel thin, insubstantial, like a story someone else has told me so many times that I've begun to believe it's my own. When I open my eyes, I'm no longer alone. She sits at the table exactly where I expected her to be, in the chair with the warm indentation, her hands folded in her lap like a lady at tea. She's exactly as I remember her, silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, flowered dress that smells of mothballs and thyme, eyes that hold depths of knowledge I'm only beginning to understand. She doesn't speak, but she doesn't need to. Her presence answers questions that I didn't know how to ask. She's been here all along, waiting patiently for me to acknowledge what I already knew. This is her house. It has always been her house. I am the guest here, the temporary resident in a space that belongs to someone else. Grandmother, I whisper, and my voice sounds like a child's voice, uncertain and small. She smiles, and in that smile I see recognition, love, and something else, something that might be pity. She reaches out one translucent hand, and I understand that I'm meant to take it. I move toward her slowly, my feet carrying me across the linoleum with dreamlike fluidity. Each step feels both inevitable and impossible, as if I'm walking through water or time itself. When I reach the table, she gestures to the chair beside her, the chair that has always been waiting for me. I sit down, and the cushion molds itself to my body with familiar comfort. This is where I belong. This is where I've always belonged. The kitchen around us settles into a deeper quiet, as if the house itself is sighing with relief. She takes my hand in hers, and her touch is exactly as I remembered it. Papery skin stretched over bird, delicate bones, warmth that seems to come from some internal fire. Her fingers trace patterns on my palm, and I realize she's writing something there in a language I don't understand, but somehow recognize. You've been lost, she says finally, her voice carrying the weight of years and secrets. But you're home now. You're finally home. The words resonate through me like a tuning fork struck against bone. Home. Yes, this feels like home in a way that the rest of my life never has. The apartment I thought was mine, the job I thought I worked, the divorce I thought I survived. All of it feels like costume jewelry now, bright and convincing from a distance, but revealing itself as cheap imitation under closer examination. This is real. This kitchen, this moment. This woman whose blood runs in my veins. This is the truth I've been circling around without knowing it. How long have I been gone? I ask, though I'm not sure I want to know the answer. Time moves differently here, she says, and her smile deepens. Long enough for you to forget. Not long enough for me to stop waiting. The moonlight shifts through the window, casting new patterns on the table between us. I notice that the missing apple has reappeared in the fruit bowl, and the moisture rings on the counter have vanished. The kitchen has restored itself to the way it should be, the way it was before my disruption. What happens now? I ask. She stands, releasing my hand with a gentle pressure that feels like blessing. Now you remember who you really are. Now you come home properly. She moves toward the doorway, and I understand that I'm meant to follow. But as I rise from the chair, I catch sight of my reflection in the kitchen window. And for a moment, I see not my face but hers, superimposed over mine like a double exposure. The boundaries between us blur and shift, and I realize with a chill that extends to my very bones that I don't know where she ends and I begin. Maybe I never did. The last thing I see before following her into the darkness of the hallway is the clock above the sink. The hands have stopped moving, frozen at 2047 a.m. Time itself has paused, waiting to see what choice I'll make. I turn away from the clock and step into the shadows, my bare feet silent on the floorboards that no longer whisper beneath my weight. Behind me, the kitchen settles into perfect stillness, empty and patient, ready for the next visitor, who will wander in from the darkness, drawn by sounds that shouldn't exist. The house breathes around us as we walk deeper into its heart, and I finally understand that some questions are better left unanswered. Some truths are too large for the small spaces we call our lives. In the distance, I can hear the gentle percussion of footsteps on tile, the soft scrape of a chair against linoleum. Someone new is coming to the kitchen, drawn by the mystery I've left behind. I don't look back. Story 2. The notification chimes at 3:17 a.m., pulling me from the edge of sleep like a fish hook dragging through deep water. My phone glows beside my pillow, casting blue light across my face in the darkness. I should ignore it. I should let whatever digital demand for attention wait until morning, when the world makes sense again and screens don't feel like windows into other dimensions. But I reach for it anyway, muscle memory stronger than wisdom. Instagram. A story notification from Coemerosid Forgotten. The username doesn't ring any bells, but my follow list has grown unwieldy over the years. College friends, coworkers, random accounts I've accumulated like digital debris. I tap on her profile picture, a blurry image of a woman with dark hair partially obscuring her face. The story loads, revealing a dimly lit room that looks strangely familiar. Hardwood floors, white walls, a window with gauzy curtains that filter moonlight into silver streams. The image is grainy, shot with poor lighting. But there's something about the composition that makes me squint at my screen. That's my living room. I sit up in bed, fully awake now, staring at the photograph. The angle is from somewhere near my bookshelf, looking toward the couch where I spent the evening binge, watching Netflix. Every detail matches, the throw pillow positioned at precisely the wrong angle, the coffee table with its collection of magazines I haven't read, the lamp I forgot to turn off before bed. But that's impossible. I live alone on the 4th floor of a secure building. I checked all the locks before going to sleep, the same ritual I've performed every night for the past 2 years. No one else has keys. No one else has access. I screenshot the story before it can disappear, then navigate to Emma Rose Forgotten's profile. Her bio is empty except for a single line, watching, always watching. She has no other posts, no profile information, just the circular story highlight that glows with unviewed content. My thumb hovers over the story again, but something stops me. In the screenshot I just took, barely visible in the corner of the frame, there's a shadow that doesn't belong. A human-shaped darkness standing just outside the reach of the lamp's light, positioned exactly where someone would need to stand to take this photograph. I zoom in until the pixels become individual squares of light and dark, but the shadow remains ambiguous. Could be a trick of the lighting, could be the way digital compression distorts images, could be a dozen rational explanations that don't require someone to be standing in my living room at 3 in the morning. My apartment feels different now, charged with the possibility of intrusion. Every familiar sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the settling of the building, the whisper of air through the heating vents, takes on sinister undertones. I slip out of bed and pad barefoot through my hallway, phone clutched in my hand like a talisman. The living room looks exactly as it did in the photograph. The lamp still glows beside my reading chair, casting the same pool of warm light. The magazines lie scattered across the coffee table in identical disarray. Even the throw pillow maintains its awkward angle against the arm of the couch. But something has changed. Something subtle and wrong that I can't quite identify. I stand in the doorway, scanning for differences, when my phone chimes again. Another story notification. Emma Rose Forgotten. This time the image shows my kitchen. The same grainy quality. The same sense of voyeuristic intrusion. My coffee mug sits beside the sink exactly where I left it, and the dishes I was too tired to wash still occupy the same spots on the counter. But the photograph is taken from inside my pantry. Looking out through the partially open door, someone is in my apartment. Someone who knows how to move through my space without triggering the motion sensors or disturbing the carefully arranged evidence of my solitary life. Someone who understands exactly where to hide. I back away from the kitchen doorway, my heart hammering against my ribs with increasing intensity. The logical part of my mind catalogues the impossibilities the building's security, the deadbolt I engaged personally, the chain lock that can only be fastened from inside. But logic feels thin and inadequate when faced with photographic evidence of violation. My phone buzzes with a text message from an unknown number. You look beautiful when you sleep. The words appear on my lock screen in clean, white text against the background of my own violated living room. I drop the phone, and it clatters against the hardwood floor with a sound that echoes through my apartment like a gunshot. In the silence that follows, I hear it. The soft click of a camera shutter. I freeze, every muscle in my body locked in place. The sound came from behind me, from the direction of my bedroom. Someone is back there right now, documenting this moment, adding my terror to their digital collection. The realization hits me with physical force. This isn't random. This is curated. Someone has been watching me long enough to know my patterns, my vulnerabilities, the exact moments when I'm most defenseless. I retrieve my phone with shaking hands and navigate back to Amorose Forgotten's profile. The story highlight now shows 3 items. I tap on the newest edition with a finger that trembles against the screen. It's a photograph of me, taken from the hallway outside my bedroom. I'm standing exactly where I am now, clutching my phone, my face illuminated by the blue glow of the screen. My expression is one of dawning horror. Mouth slightly open, eyes wide with the kind of fear that transforms familiar spaces into landscapes of threat. But the most disturbing detail isn't my face. It's what's visible behind me in the photograph. My bedroom door is open, and through it, I can see my bed. The covers are turned down, as if someone has just risen from them. And there's an indentation in the pillow beside where my head was resting. Someone was lying next to me while I slept. Even the thought makes my skin crawl with retroactive violation. All those nights I've slept peacefully in this apartment, believing myself alone and secure, and someone has been sharing my bed, breathing my air, watching my dreams play out across my sleeping features. I want to run, but where can I go? The front door suddenly seems impossibly far away, and I don't know what waits between me and escape. I don't know if the person taking these photographs is blocking my exit, forcing me deeper into my own home like a rat in a maze. Another notification, another story. This one shows my bathroom, the mirror above my sink, my toothbrush in its holder. The prescription bottles lined up with obsessive precision on the counter. But it's taken from inside my shower, looking out through the clear glass door. I can see water droplets still clinging to the surface, evidence of my shower earlier that evening. How long have they been here? How long have they been documenting the intimate details of my daily routine? I scroll through Amorose Forgotten's followers. Just 3 accounts, all private, all with profile pictures that show only darkness. But when I check who she's following, I find hundreds of accounts. All of them appear to be women living alone. All of them have profile pictures that show portions of faces, never quite complete, as if the photographer prefers fragments to wholes. My phone vibrates with another text. Don't be afraid. I've been keeping you safe. Safe from what? The question forms in my mind, but doesn't reach my lips. I'm afraid that speaking aloud will reveal my location to whoever is moving through my apartment like a ghost, documenting my terror with the methodical precision of a scientist collecting specimens. I edge toward my front door, staying close to the wall, trying to minimize my exposure to sight lines from other rooms. Each step feels like an eternity, and I expect at any moment to hear footsteps behind me, to feel a hand on my shoulder, to turn around and finally see the face that belongs to the presence I've been sensing. But I make it to the door without incident. My fingers find the deadbolt, and I'm surprised to discover it's already unlocked. The chain hangs loose beside the frame, and I have no memory of unfastening either security measure. But then, memory has become unreliable, corrupted by fear and the possibility that nothing I believe about my life is entirely accurate. I open the door and step into the hallway. But before I can close it behind me, my phone chimes one final time. The newest story shows the hallway where I'm standing. It's taken from just outside my apartment door, looking back toward the elevator. I can see myself in the frame, a small, frightened figure in pajamas, clutching a phone like a lifeline. But what makes me gasp audibly is the timestamp visible in the corner of the image. It shows a date from 6 months ago. I scroll back through the Emerosi Forgotten's previous stories, the ones I somehow missed despite my obsessive social media consumption. There I am, sleeping peacefully, while a shadowy figure arranges my covers. There I am, cooking dinner while someone photographs me from inside my refrigerator. There I am, getting dressed for work while eyes I never saw watched from my closet. 6 months of documentation. 6 months of intimate surveillance. 6 months of someone living in the margins of my life, collecting moments I thought were private. But the most disturbing revelation comes when I check the story views. Each photograph has been seen by dozens of accounts, all private, all anonymous, all part of some network I never knew existed. My life has been entertainment for strangers, my privacy commodified and distributed to an audience of voyeurs. I lean against the hallway wall, my legs suddenly unsteady beneath me. The building around me no longer feels like shelter. It feels like a stage set, every corridor and doorway a potential hiding place for watchers I can't see. My phone buzzes with another text from the unknown number, room 237. Come home, Emma. Emma. The name from the Instagram account. But that's not my name. I've never been Emma, never answered to that name, never identified with it in any way. Yet seeing it in connection with these photographs of my life creates a dissonance that makes my vision blur. What if I've been wrong about everything? What if the name I think is mine, the identity I've constructed, the memories I carry, what if none of it belongs to me? What if Emma is my real name, and everything else is just a story I've told myself to make sense of a life that never made sense to begin with? I take the elevator to the second floor and walk down the hallway toward room 237. The number feels significant, weighted with meaning I can't quite grasp. When I reach the door, I find it already open, just a crack, enough to see warm light spilling out into the corridor. I push the door open and step inside. The apartment is identical to mine. Same layout, same hardwood floors, same window placement. But this one feels lived in a way mine never has. Personal photographs cover every surface, showing the same woman over and over, dark hair, pale skin, eyes that seem to follow me as I move through the room. It's my face in every picture, but they show a life I don't remember living. Here I am at a birthday party, surrounded by friends I don't recognize. Here I am on vacation in a place I've never been. Here I am with family members whose faces are strangers to me. On the coffee table, there's a journal open to a page covered in handwriting I recognize as my own, though I have no memory of forming these words. F-Day 847. The other me is beginning to remember. I can see it in her eyes when she looks in mirrors, the way she pauses as if trying to recall something just out of reach. Soon, she'll understand that she's been living my backup life, the pale copy I created when the real world became too much to bear. The watchers help me keep track of both versions, document the differences, make sure neither one forgets entirely. She thinks someone is stalking her, but she's stalking herself. The Instagram account, the photographs, the messages, all of it comes from the part of her mind that remembers being me. Emma, the original. The one who couldn't handle the weight of existing in a world that demanded too much presence, too much consistency, too much continuous selfhood. Of tomorrow I'll integrate the fragments. Tomorrow we'll remember how to be one person instead of two. I close the journal with hands that shake like autumn leaves. The apartment around me feels both foreign and familiar, like a childhood home revisited after decades of absence. Everything here belongs to me, but to a version of me I've forgotten how to be. A figure emerges from the bedroom, a woman who looks exactly like me, but carries herself with a confidence I've never possessed. She smiles as if greeting an old friend, and when she speaks, her voice is my voice, but richer, more certain. "Hello," she says. "I've been waiting for you to come home." I want to run, but I realize I have nowhere to go. The apartment upstairs, the life I thought was mine, it was never real. It was just a holding pattern, a place to exist while the real me lived down here, documenting our shared existence through social media accounts and surveillance photographs. "Are you Emma?" I ask, though I already know the answer.
"We both are,"
she says. I'm just the part that remembers. She takes my hand, and her touch feels like recognition, like pieces of myself clicking back into place after years of floating separately in space. The fears that drove me from my apartment, the terror of being watched and documented, it all dissolves into understanding. I wasn't being stalked. I was being reminded. As dawn light begins to filter through the windows, she shows me the rest of the apartment. Our apartment. Every room holds evidence of the life I forgot I was living: paintings I don't remember creating, books annotated in my handwriting, clothes that fit perfectly despite my never having purchased them. Why did I split? I ask. Because being one person was too hard, she explains. Too much pressure to maintain a consistent identity, to remember who you're supposed to be from moment to moment. It was easier to create a backup self, someone who could handle the ordinary days while I dealt with the extraordinary ones. She leads me to a computer to set up in the corner of the living room. Multiple monitors displaying social media accounts, surveillance feeds, and what appears to be a complex scheduling system. This is the nerve center of our divided existence, the place where Emma coordinates both lives, making sure neither version suspects the truth for too long. The Instagram account was getting too obvious, she admits. You were starting to put the pieces together faster than I anticipated. But that's good. It means you're ready to integrate. Integration. The word carries weight I don't fully understand, but I sense it represents a fundamental change, a loss of the simplicity that came with believing I was just one person living one uncomplicated life. What if I like being the backup? I ask. What if I want to go back upstairs and pretend none of this happened? She considers this seriously, as if it's a genuine option. You could try, she says finally. But now that you know the truth, the division won't hold. You'll start remembering more and more of my life, our life, until the boundaries dissolve completely. The only choice is whether you want to integrate consciously or let it happen gradually, chaotically. Through the window, I can see my building waking up. Lights coming on in apartments. The early commuters beginning their journeys to jobs that define them. The ordinary world continues its ordinary routines, blissfully unaware that identity is far more fluid than anyone wants to admit. I think about the woman I was an hour ago, the one who believed her biggest problem was an unknown Instagram stalker. She seems like a character from a story I read long ago, simple, linear, contained within the boundaries of a single perspective. But Emma is vast, contradictory, capable of existing in multiple states simultaneously. She's the part of me that creates and destroys, that loves and fears, that documents and hides. She's messy and complex and real in ways that my backup self never was. Okay, I say finally, show me how to be whole. She smiles and leads me to the mirror that hangs above her dresser, our dresser. In the reflection, I see both of us side by side, the simple backup and the complex original. But as I watch, the boundaries begin to blur. Our faces merge and separate like smoke, until I can no longer tell where I end and she begins. The Instagram notifications have stopped chiming. Hi Emma Rosed forgotten story highlights are gone, replaced by a single post that shows an empty room. The apartment upstairs, stripped of all evidence that anyone ever lived there. The caption reads, "Coming home." I understand now that the terror I felt wasn't about being watched by a stranger. It was about being seen by myself, the part of me I'd forgotten existed, the part that was patient enough to wait, clever enough to leave clues, loving enough to guide me back to wholeness when I was ready. Outside, the sun rises over a city full of people who believe they know who they are. But I know better now. I know that identity is a story we tell ourselves, and like all stories, it can be edited, revised, fragmented, and made whole again. The notifications may have stopped, but I keep the Instagram account active. Not for stalking or surveillance, but as a reminder that there are always other versions of ourselves living in the margins, waiting to be remembered. Sometimes, late at night when the world grows quiet and thin, I'll post a story. Just a simple image of my living room, my kitchen, my reflection in the mirror. For anyone else who might be living a backup life, anyone else who suspects they're not quite whole. The caption always reads the same. Come home when you're ready. And sometimes, just sometimes, I get a notification that someone has viewed it. Someone who understands that home isn't a place. It's a return to yourself, complete and unafraid of your own complexity. The house breathes around me as I settle into sleep, no longer divided, no longer watching myself from the shadows. I am the watcher and the watched, the documenter and the documented, the Emma who remembers and the one who forgot. I am finally, completely, terrifyingly whole. Story 3. My skin has been whispering to me again. It started 3 months ago, just after my 33rd birthday, when I noticed the first thread. I was examining myself in the bathroom mirror after my evening shower, running my hands along the familiar topography of my body, when I felt it, a single strand impossibly fine, protruding from just below my left breast. At first glance, it looked like a hair that had somehow grown in the wrong place. But when I pinched it between my thumb and forefinger, it felt different. Smoother, more substantial. Like spun silk or the kind of thread used in expensive embroidery. I pulled gently, expecting it to come free with a slight sting. Instead, it yielded with a sensation that was neither pain nor pleasure, but something entirely new. A deep, resonant vibration that seemed to travel through my entire body. The thread lengthened as I drew it out, revealing itself to be longer than should be possible. Much longer. I wound it around my finger, watching the delicate strand catch the bathroom light like spider silk dusted with silver. Where it had emerged from my skin, there was no wound, no irritation, just a tiny puncture mark, perfectly circular, that sealed itself as I watched. That night, I dreamed of looms and spinning wheels, of women's hands working thread into patterns I couldn't quite remember upon waking. The dreams felt more like memories, inherited knowledge passed down through generations of bodies that looked like mine. The second thread appeared a week later, this one emerging from my right shoulder blade. I discovered it while getting dressed for work, feeling something catch against my shirt. This one was deeper in color, more golden than silver, and when I pulled it free, it sang, a high, clear note that seemed to resonate in my bones. I should have been alarmed. I should have made a doctor's appointment, submitted myself to the rational processes of medical examination and scientific explanation. But instead, I found myself fascinated. The threads were beautiful, unlike anything I'd ever seen or touched, and the sensation of drawing them from my body was intoxicating. Not sexual exactly, but deeply intimate, as if I were discovering secret chambers within myself. By the end of the second month, I was producing threads daily. They emerged from different locations: my thighs, my arms, the delicate skin at my wrists, each one unique in color and texture, each one requiring its own particular technique for extraction. Some came easily with gentle pressure. Others needed to be coaxed out with careful manipulation of the surrounding skin. I began collecting them in a wooden box that had belonged to my grandmother, winding each thread around small spools I'd purchased from a craft store. The box filled quickly. Silver threads, golden threads, some so dark they appeared black, others that shifted color in different light like oil on water. I found myself spending hours examining my collection, running my fingers through the accumulated strands, listening to the subtle music they made when they brushed against each other. Each thread seemed to carry a memory, a fragment of experience I couldn't quite access, but could sense lingering at the edges of consciousness. The threads began appearing more frequently. What started as a weekly occurrence became daily, then hourly. I would be at work, sitting in meetings or typing at my computer when I would feel that familiar sensation, the slight pressure beneath my skin, the building need for release. I learned to excuse myself and retreat to bathroom stalls, where I would carefully extract the latest thread and slip it into a small pouch I'd begun carrying. My coworkers started commenting on my frequent absences, but I brushed off their concerns with excuses about digestive issues and stress. How could I explain that my body was becoming a factory for something impossible? Something that challenged every assumption about the boundaries between internal and external, self and other. The threads weren't random. I began to realize they followed patterns, emerging in sequences that seemed to correspond to emotional states, memories, phases of the moon. The silver threads came when I was sad, the golden ones during moments of joy or arousal. The black threads emerged after nightmares, and the color, shifting ones appeared when I thought about my mother. My mother, who had died when I was 16. My mother, whose hands had been constantly busy with needlework, embroidery, knitting projects that seemed to multiply endlessly throughout our house. My mother, who used to stroke my hair and tell me stories about women who could spin straw into gold, who could weave moonlight into cloth, who could pull the very essence of their experiences from their bodies and transform it into something beautiful. I had forgotten those stories until the threads began appearing. But now, as I sat surrounded by spools of impossible fiber, her words came back to me with crystalline clarity. She hadn't been telling fairy tales. She had been preparing me for this transformation, this becoming. The first time I tried to weave the threads together, my fingers seemed to know what to do, despite having no formal training. The movements came naturally, as if muscle memory had been sleeping in my hands for decades, waiting for the right materials to wake it up. The resulting fabric was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Simultaneously delicate and strong, with a luminescence that seemed to come from within. But as the weeks passed, the extraction process began to change. What had once been pleasurable became increasingly intense, almost overwhelming. The threads grew thicker, more resistant to removal. Some required tools, tweezers, small scissors, implements I had to purchase discreetly from medical supply stores. I started taking sick days, calling in with vague complaints, while I spent entire afternoons in my bathroom, working to extract the increasingly complex fibers my body was producing. The threads began emerging in clusters, braided together beneath my skin in patterns that required careful untangling. Some were so deeply embedded that I had to make small incisions to access them, using razor blades sterilized with rubbing alcohol. The cuts healed quickly, faster than they should have, leaving behind tiny scars that formed intricate patterns across my skin. Looking at myself in the mirror, I began to see that my body was becoming a map of this strange process, marked with the evidence of each extraction. I should have been afraid. I should have sought help, but the compulsion to continue was stronger than rational thought. Each thread extracted brought a rush of relief, so profound that I craved it constantly. I found myself checking my skin obsessively, feeling for the telltale pressure that indicated new growth, new material ready for harvest. The threads began to cluster around specific areas. My heart, my womb, the base of my throat, where words lived before becoming speech. These locations produced the most beautiful fibers, but also the most painful to extract. The process became a kind of archaeology, each thread revealing layers of myself I hadn't known existed. I started having blackouts during particularly intense extraction sessions. I would begin working on a cluster of threads around my ribs, and the next thing I knew, hours had passed, and I was sitting on my bathroom floor, surrounded by spools of new material. My body marked with precise incisions I had no memory of making. During these lost hours, I apparently continued weaving. I would return to consciousness to find new pieces of fabric draped around my bathroom. Intricate tapestries that told stories I couldn't read, but somehow understood. They showed women's bodies opening like flowers, releasing streams of light that became rivers, mountains, entire landscapes. They showed the moment of birth, not of children but of worlds, universes spilling from between legs like cosmic discharge. The tapestries were beautiful, but they disturbed me in ways I couldn't articulate. They suggested that whatever was happening to my body wasn't unique to me, that it was part of some larger pattern, some evolutionary step that women's bodies had been preparing for across generations. I began researching, spending my wakeful hours searching through medical journals, mythology texts, anthropological studies. I found scattered references to similar phenomena. Women throughout history who claimed to produce textile materials from their own bodies, who created art from substances that shouldn't exist. Most of these accounts had been dismissed as hysteria, delusion, the fevered imaginings of minds unable to cope with the restrictive roles society had assigned to female bodies. But reading them now, with threads of my own making spread across my bathroom counter, I recognized the truth in their testimonies. We had been trying to tell them. For centuries, women had been trying to explain that our bodies were capable of more than reproduction and pleasure, that we contained worlds within ourselves that demanded expression. But who would listen to such claims? Who would believe that flesh could become art, that suffering could literally be spun into beauty? The extraction process began requiring more invasive procedures. The threads grew so deep and interconnected that I had to use increasingly sharp instruments to access them. I purchased surgical tools online, watched YouTube videos about suturing techniques, learned to give myself local anesthesia for the more complex procedures. My bathroom became an operating theater. I installed better lighting, purchased a magnifying mirror, organized my tools in sterile containers. The methodical preparation became as important as the extraction itself, a ritual that helped me access the trance state necessary for the deeper work. But even with anesthesia, the pain was becoming unbearable. Not physical pain, that I could manage with chemicals and careful technique. The unbearable part was the emotional intensity of each thread's removal. It was as if I were extracting memories, experiences, pieces of my identity that had been woven so deeply into my flesh that removing them left me fundamentally changed. I began to lose track of who I had been before this started. The woman who had lived in this apartment, who had held down a job, who had maintained relationships with friends and family. She felt like a character from a story I'd read long ago. The real me was the one who existed in the bathroom with my tools and my threads, the one who understood that transformation requires a willingness to come apart completely. The threads began emerging with messages attached. Not written messages, but impressions. Sensations that conveyed meaning more directly than words ever could. They told me about my mother's death, about the threads she had been producing in secret during her final months, the tapestries she had hidden in the attic because she knew no one would understand. They told me about my grandmother, about the generations of women in my family who had carried this capacity in their genes, who had suppressed it or hidden it or channeled it into more acceptable forms of creation. They told me that I was the first to let it fully manifest, the first to choose transformation over suppression. The tapestries I wove during my blackouts began showing my future, or futures, plural, in some. I continued this process until I was more thread than flesh, a living loom that produced beauty from the raw material of existence. In others, I found ways to teach other women how to access their own capacity for literal self-expression, how to turn their pain into something tangible and valuable. But in all of them, I was no longer recognizably human. The extraction process was changing my fundamental nature, revealing that the boundaries between body and art, between self and creation, had always been more permeable than anyone wanted to admit. I stopped going to work entirely, stopped answering phone calls from worried friends. The world outside my bathroom felt increasingly foreign, populated by people who had accepted the limitation that their bodies were simply containers for consciousness, rather than potential sources of infinite creation. The final extraction began 3 days ago. I woke to find my entire torso covered in raised lines, where threads were trying to emerge simultaneously. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all pushing against my skin from within like a chrysalis ready to split open. I knew this would be different from the gradual extractions I'd been performing. This was complete metamorphosis, the moment when whatever I'd been becoming would finally reveal itself. I prepared my bathroom carefully, laid out towels to absorb whatever fluids might be released, arranged my tools in order of likely necessity. The first incision released a flood of threads so beautiful they made me weep. They poured from the opening like liquid light, each one carrying sensations of memories I'd never lived but somehow possessed. I was my mother giving birth to me. I was my grandmother teaching her daughter to embroider. I was countless women whose names had been forgotten, but whose capacity for creation lived on in the threads now filling my bathroom. As more of my skin opened, I began to understand that this wasn't destruction. It was revelation. My body wasn't coming apart. It was showing me what it had always been beneath the surface appearance of solid flesh. I was a network of connections, a living tapestry that had been masquerading as a simple human form. The threads continued flowing, and I continued weaving, even as the boundaries between my body and my art dissolved completely. I was creating myself as I created the tapestries, becoming the medium and the message simultaneously. Now, as I sit here in my transformed bathroom, surrounded by threads that pulse with their own light, I understand that this was never about illness or mutation. This was about evolution, about the next stage of what women's bodies might become when freed from the constraints of biological utility. I am still me, but I am also something new, a creature capable of literal self-expression, of transforming pain into beauty, of demonstrating that the boundary between interior and exterior experience has always been an arbitrary limitation. The threads continue to flow, and I continue to weave them into patterns that tell the story of this transformation. Soon, others will find these tapestries, will see in them the possibility of their own metamorphosis. The process is contagious, passed not through infection, but through recognition. Through seeing what you've always carried inside yourself, reflected in someone else's courage to become. My skin whispers still, but now I understand the language. It's telling me that this is only the beginning, that there are other women waking up to lumps beneath their skin, other bodies preparing to reveal their true nature as sources of infinite creation. We are not breaking down. We are breaking open, and the world will never be quite the same. Story 4. Thus, on March 15th, Dr. Reeves suggested I start keeping a journal. She says it will help me track my thoughts, identify patterns, maintain a sense of continuity during the episodes. I hate that word, episodes. Like my reality is a television show that keeps getting cancelled and renewed with different cast members. The handwriting feels strange under my fingers today. Too controlled, too careful. Like I'm writing someone else's thoughts with someone else's hands. But Dr. Reeves says this feeling will pass, that medication takes time to reach therapeutic levels in the bloodstream. I live alone now. Sarah moved out after what happened in December, though I still find her hair elastics in strange places. Wound around the bathroom faucet, looped through the handle of my coffee mug, threaded through the pages of books I don't remember reading. Physical reminders of a relationship that may or may not have existed in the way I remember it. The apartment feels too big for one person, but also too small. Contradictions everywhere. The walls press inward during the day, but stretch infinitely outward at night. I've started sleeping in the living room because the bedroom feels like it belongs to someone else. Someone who made different choices. Someone who never heard voices in the electrical outlets. March 18th, I missed 2 days. Found this journal open on my kitchen counter, with words I don't remember writing. The mirrors know. They've been talking to each other when I'm not looking. Planning something. Sarah wasn't real. She was just a reflection that got confused about which side of the glass she belonged on. Dr. Reeves is helping the mirrors. Her office has 17 reflective surfaces. I counted them yesterday while she wasn't watching. That's not my handwriting. The letters slant differently, pressed harder into the paper, like someone was angry while writing. But who else could have access to my apartment? My journal, my thoughts. Dr. Reeves says dissociation is common during the adjustment period. That parts of my mind might feel separate from other parts, like passengers in the same car who don't acknowledge each other's presence. She's prescribed something new, small white pills that taste like chalk and leave a metallic residue on my tongue. March 19th. The pills make everything soft around the edges. Colors blur into each other like watercolors left in the rain. Sounds arrive a few seconds after the events that create them, so I'm always living slightly in the past, watching my hands move before feeling them move. I found a grocery list written in my handwriting, milk, but I'm lactose intolerant. Cat foods, I don't have a cat. Flowers for Mom's grave, Mom is alive. Living in Phoenix, rope. The last item was crossed out so violently that the pen tore through the paper. I threw the list away, but it keeps reappearing in my coat pocket, between the pages of magazines taped to the inside of my refrigerator door. Sarah called, or I think she called. The phone rang, and when I answered, there was breathing and then her voice, very distant, saying my name over and over. But when I tried to respond, the line went dead. When I checked my call log, there was no record of any incoming calls. Dr. Reeves says phone hallucinations are a documented phenomenon. That my brain is creating sensory experiences to fill gaps in memory, in connection, in the coherent narrative I keep trying to construct about who I am and where I belong. March 22nd, 3 days gone again. This journal is becoming unreliable, full of gaps and inconsistencies. But I found something else. Pages torn out and hidden inside my freezer, wrapped in aluminum foil like leftovers I was saving for later. The frozen pages, when thawed, revealed entries I have no memory of writing. Day 847C of the Sarah experiment, still convinced she existed. Still finding evidence of her presence, despite all rational indicators to the contrary. The subject continues to resist integration. Maintains the fiction that multiple perspectives require multiple personalities, rather than accepting the more elegant explanation. There is only one mind here, creating complexity through division. Subject exhibits classic symptoms of manufactured trauma. Keeps searching for external causes for internal fragmentation. Refuses to accept that the splits preceded the explanations, that the voices came first and the stories came later. That medication compliance remains problematic. Subject continues to flush pills, believing they're meant to suppress rather than integrate. Doesn't understand that synthesis requires breaking down existing structures first. The handwriting is definitely mine, but the voice is clinical, detached, like I'm observing myself from the outside. Like I'm both the scientist and the experiment, the observer and the observed. It's March 23rd. I flushed the pills down the toilet. All of them. The sound they made hitting the water was like tiny bones breaking, like promises being dissolved in acid. Dr. Reeves called, or someone called claiming to be Dr. Reeves. The voice was right, but the words were wrong. Too precise, like someone reading from a script. She wanted to know about my medication compliance and my integration progress. When I asked her what integration meant, she hung up. I checked my insurance records. There's no Dr. Reeves listed as my provider. There's no record of any psychiatric treatment at all. But I have clear memories of her office, her voice, the way she clicked her pen while taking notes. I remember the 17 reflective surfaces, the way my reflection seemed to lag behind my movements in the window behind her desk. Memory is becoming unreliable. Not just recent memory, everything. I can't remember if I've always lived alone or if Sarah was real. I can't remember if my mother is dead or alive, if I have a job or if I'm on disability, if the voices started before the medication or after. March 24th, found a video on my phone. Me, sitting in this same chair, writing in this same journal. But I'm saying things out loud while I write, having conversations with people who aren't visible in the frame. Could you pass me the blue pen? No, the other blue pen. The one you bought at that stationery store downtown. Dr. Reeves, I know you can hear me through the journal. Are you satisfied with my progress? Am I integrating the way you hoped I would? Mom, I'm going to visit your grave next week. I know you're not really dead, but I need to put flowers somewhere, need to practice grieving so I remember how it feels. In the video, I pause between sentences as if listening to responses, nodding and smiling at empty air. My face is animated, engaged, like I'm having the most natural conversation in the world. But the apartment is silent except for my voice. I don't remember recording this video. I don't remember having these conversations. But the timestamp shows it was filmed yesterday during one of the gaps in my journal entries. It was March 25th. I'm not alone in this apartment. I found breakfast dishes in the sink that I don't remember using. 2 plates, 2 cups, like someone shared a meal with me. The second cup still had lipstick on the rim, a shade I don't own, never wear. In the bathroom, there are 2 toothbrushes in the holder. The second one is wet, recently used. When I opened the medicine cabinet, I found prescriptions with my name on them, but for medications I've never heard of. Antipsychotics, mood stabilizers, something called an integration catalyst. The apartment feels crowded now, like there are too many people living in too small a space. I hear conversations in other rooms, multiple voices discussing my condition, my progress, my resistance to treatment. But when I investigate, the rooms are empty, the voices stop, and I'm left with only the echo of words I almost understood. Sarah's clothes are back in the closet. Not all of them, but enough to suggest someone is living here. Someone who needs less space than I do, but more presence. Her books are on my nightstand, bookmarked at passages about identity disorders and fractured consciousness. March 2026. The handwriting in this journal keeps changing. Sometimes it's neat and controlled, sometimes rushed and desperate, sometimes so careful it looks like calligraphy practice. I'm starting to think multiple people have access to these pages, multiple versions of my story being written simultaneously. Dr. Reeves appeared in my living room today, not knocked on the door, not let herself in, just appeared, sitting in my reading chair as if she'd been there all along. She looked exactly as I remembered. Gray hair pulled back severely, wire-rimmed glasses that reflected light in ways that made it hard to see her eyes. "We need to talk," she said, and her voice carried the authority of someone who'd been treating me for months. But when I blinked, she was gone. Just the chair. Still warm where her body had been, still holding the impression of someone recently present. I called the number I thought was hers, but it went to a pizza place downtown. The person who answered had never heard of Dr. Reeves, said their number had been the same for 15 years. That's March 28th. 2 days missing again. Found this journal in the refrigerator, wrapped in a sweater that smells like Sarah's perfume. The pages between the 26th and today are filled with handwriting that looks like mine, but describes experiences I don't remember having. 5N's Integration Day 30 subject is beginning to accept that the multiple perspectives were always internal rather than external. Sarah, Dr. Reeves. The various voices, all aspects of a single consciousness that fragmented under stress and now requires careful reassembly. The medication was never meant to suppress symptoms, but to facilitate communication between fragments. Each episode is actually an integration session, a chance for the various aspects of self to negotiate shared reality. Of progress is encouraging. Subject no longer flushes pills, no longer questions the presence of others in the apartment. Beginning to understand that healing requires accepting multiplicity rather than demanding unity. I don't remember writing these words. Don't remember thinking these thoughts. But they're in my handwriting, in my journal, describing my life with an accuracy that feels both intimate and invasive. As March 29. Sarah made breakfast this morning. I woke to the smell of coffee and found her in my kitchen, wearing one of my T-shirts, humming a song I recognized but couldn't place. She looked exactly as I remembered, dark hair falling across her face. That small scar above her left eyebrow from a childhood accident she'd told me about dozen of times. "Good morning, baby," she said, and her voice was perfect, completely real. "I made your coffee the way you like it. Extra sugar, no cream. But I drink my coffee black. I've always drunk my coffee black." When I pointed this out, her face flickered like a television with bad reception. for just a moment. I could see through her to the kitchen wall behind, could see the way the morning light passed through her body without casting shadows. "I'm not Sarah," she said, but her voice was my voice now, speaking through her mouth. "I'm the part of you that remembers being loved, being connected to another person. You created me to feel less alone, but you created me wrong. Too separate, too independent. I was supposed to be a memory, but I became a person." She sat down across from me at the table, and I could hear the chair creak under her weight, could smell the shampoo in her hair. Real in every way except the most fundamental one. "Dr. Reeves is here, too," she continued. "But she's harder to see, because she represents the part of you that wants to get better, and you're not sure you're ready for that yet. She exists in mirrors and phone calls, and professional authority figures, because that's how you experience the desire for external validation of your internal experience." I reached across the table to touch her hand, and my fingers passed through her wrist like water. But I could still see her, still hear her breathing, still smell the coffee she'd made with hands that couldn't hold anything. March 30th. The integration is accelerating. I can feel the boundaries dissolving, the artificial separations that created the illusion of multiple people living in my head. Sarah comes and goes more transparently now, flickering in and out of existence like a light bulb with a loose connection. Dr. Reeves appears as needed. Usually, when I'm trying to understand what's happening to me, then fades back into the professional competence I've internalized from years of therapy. But there are others I haven't written about, haven't acknowledged. The angry one who throws things and writes violent messages on my bathroom mirror. The frightened one who hides under beds and in closets, who checks locks obsessively and sleeps with lights on. The practical one who pays bills and remembers appointments and maintains the basic functions of daily life. They're all me. They've always been me. But acknowledging this feels like a kind of death, like agreeing to the dissolution of people I've come to care about even though they never existed independently. The apartment feels less crowded now, but also more empty. As the fragments integrate, I'm losing the comfort of internal company, the sense that I'm never truly alone. Integration means accepting that I am one person carrying the weight of multiple perspectives, multiple ways of responding to the world. A sex March 31st day. This is probably the last entry I'll write as separate voices. Tomorrow, or maybe later today, the integration will be complete, and there will be only one person writing in this journal. One person living in this apartment, one person taking medication, one person working with a therapist to maintain the stability that allows for complexity without fragmentation. Sarah came to say goodbye this morning. She looked more translucent than ever, like fog shaped into human form. "I won't disappear entirely," she promised. "I'll just become the part of you that knows how to love and be loved. Instead of being a separate person, I'll be the capacity for connection." Doctum. Reeves appeared for her final session, sitting in my living room chair with perfect professional posture. Integration doesn't mean the elimination of internal diversity, she explained in the calm voice I'd given her. It means learning to experience multiple perspectives as aspects of a single complex identity rather than as separate entities requiring separate treatment. Even the angry one came forward. But instead of breaking things, she simply said, "I was protecting us the only way I knew how. By keeping the pain separate, keeping it contained in someone else's experience. But you don't need that protection anymore. You're strong enough to feel everything directly." They're right. I am strong enough now. Her strong enough to be one person who contains multitudes, who can access different ways of being without fragmenting into different beings. Strong enough to live with the complexity of human consciousness without needing to divide it into manageable pieces. The journal feels different under my hands now, like I'm writing with the accumulated strength of all the voices that have contributed to these pages. Like I'm finally writing as myself. Not the self I thought I was, but the self I actually am, complicated, contradictory, capable of holding multiple truths simultaneously. April 1st, I woke up this morning, and there was only one coffee cup in the sink, only one toothbrush in the holder, only one person's reflection in the bathroom mirror, mine complete and undivided. The apartment feels the right size now, not too big, not too small, but exactly proportioned for someone who understands that solitude and loneliness are different things, that you can be alone without being abandoned, complete without being simple. Dr. Reeves, the real one, the one with the actual license and the downtown office, called to schedule my next appointment. Her voice sounds different than the internal version I created, warmer but less omniscient, more human. "How are the integration exercises going?" she asked. They worked. I told her. I think they worked. I can still access the different perspectives when I need them. Sarah's capacity for love, Dr. Reeves' analytical clarity, the angry one's protective instincts, the frightened one's caution. But they exist as aspects of my personality rather than as separate personalities. Colors in my emotional palette rather than different artists fighting over the canvas. The journal will continue, but the handwriting won't change anymore. The voice will remain consistent because it's my voice now, fully integrated. Speaking with the authority of someone who has learned to contain contradictions without being torn apart by them. This is what healing looks like. Not the elimination of complexity, but the integration of fragments into a coherent whole. Not the silencing of internal voices, but the orchestration of them into a single, rich, multifaceted song. I am alone in this apartment, but I am not lonely. I am one person, but I am not simple. I am healing, but I am not healed, because healing is not a destination, but a continuous process of integration, of choosing wholeness over fragmentation, complexity over simplification. The mirrors in my apartment reflect only me now, but what they show is more interesting than what they used to show. A person complex is enough to contain multiple perspectives, strong enough to experience the full spectrum of human emotion, integrated enough to write her own story with her own voice. This is who I am. This is who I've always been. Underneath the fractures and the fragments and the desperate attempts to make sense of a consciousness too rich to be contained in simple categories. I close this journal now with my own hand, in my own voice, as my own self, complete at last. Story 5. The projector hummed in the corner of my grandmother's attic, its mechanical breathing, the only sound breaking the midnight silence. I had discovered it earlier, that evening while sorting through her belongings, a vintage Kodak carousel from the 1970s, still threaded with a carousel of slides she'd never shown me. The attic smelled of dust and lavender sachets, that particular scent of old fabric and forgotten memories. My fingertips traced the projector's warm metal surface, feeling the vibrations travel up through my arms. There was something oddly comforting about the steady whir, like a cat's purr in the darkness. I had meant to wait until morning to view the slides in proper light, with my mother present. But sleep eluded me in this house, where every board creaked with unfamiliar voices, where shadows fell at angles I couldn't quite understand. The projector seemed to call to me, its red power light blinking like a patient eye. The first slide clicked into place with a satisfying mechanical snap. The image bloomed against the white sheet I'd hung on the far wall. My grandmother as a young woman, perhaps 25, standing in a garden I recognized as the one below this very window. Her smile was radiant, her dark hair catching sunlight that seemed to pour from the projection itself. Click. The carousel advanced. Another garden scene, but now she stood beside a man I didn't recognize. Tall, thin, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He wasn't my grandfather. I had seen enough family photos to know every line of my grandfather's face. This stranger's hand rested gently on her shoulder, and something in their posture spoke of intimacy, of secrets shared in whispered conversations. My fingers found the advance button again, drawn by a curiosity that felt heavier than mere interest. The mechanical click echoed in the confined space, seeming louder than before. The third slide showed them dancing, the same man and my grandmother, in what appeared to be a dimly lit room. But something was wrong with the lighting in the photograph. Shadows fell in impossible directions, and the man's face seemed slightly blurred, as if he had been moving even as the shutter snapped. I leaned closer to the projection, my breath creating small clouds in the cool air. The house's heating had been turned off for months, but I hadn't noticed the cold until now. Goosebumps rose along my arms as I studied the dancing figures. There was something in the man's expression, something that made my stomach tighten with unnamed unease. Click. The fourth slide was darker, the image quality poor. My grandmother sat alone at a table, her face older now, perhaps 30. She was looking directly at the camera with an expression I had never seen on her face in life. A mixture of fear and resignation that made my throat constrict. Behind her, barely visible in the photographic grain, stood a figure. The same man, but now his features seemed indistinct, fluid, as if the photograph couldn't quite capture his true appearance. My hand hesitated over the advance button. The projector's humming seemed to grow louder, more insistent. I could feel the vibration in my chest now, a second heartbeat that wasn't quite in rhythm with my own. Click. Slide 5 showed my grandmother's wedding day, but not to my grandfather. She stood in a white dress beside the same mysterious man. But his face in this photograph was completely obscured by what appeared to be a double exposure, a ghostly overlay that made my eyes water to look at directly. The other people in the wedding party, bridesmaids, family members, all faced away from the camera, their backs turned as if in shame or fear. I had never heard of this marriage. In all the family stories, all the carefully preserved albums, my grandmother had only ever been married once. To the grandfather, I remembered from my childhood. Yet here was evidence of something else entirely, something that had been carefully hidden away in this dusty carousel. The projector clicked on its own. I jerked back from the machine, my heart hammering against my ribs. But no, my finger must have slipped, must have brushed the button without my awareness. The slide that now filled the makeshift screen made me question that rational explanation. It was a photograph of this very attic. The same exposed beams, the same small window, even the same white sheet hanging where I had placed it. But in the photograph, a figure sat in the exact spot where I now knelt. The image was too dark to make out features clearly, but the silhouette was wrong somehow. Too tall, too angular, joints bending in ways that human joints shouldn't bend. My breathing came in short, sharp gasps that seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. The projector's humming had taken on an almost musical quality, a low melody that seemed to pulse in time with the throbbing in my temples. Click, click, click. The carousel advanced rapidly now, though I wasn't touching the controls. Images flashed against the sheet in quick succession, my grandmother growing older, but always with that same strange man beside her, his features becoming less and less human with each photograph. In some images, he cast no shadow. In others, his reflection failed to appear in mirrors and windows that should have shown his face. The photographs began to show scenes I couldn't possibly be seeing. Images of my grandmother in places she had never been, doing things she had never done. Or had she? Memory is such a fragile thing, I found myself thinking. How could I be certain of anything I thought I knew about her life? In one slide, she stood in this very attic, looking directly at the camera with an expression of infinite sadness. Behind her, dozens of carousel projectors hummed in endless rows, their red lights blinking like watching eyes. Each projector cast its own image onto invisible screens, creating a maze of overlapping realities that made my vision blur and shift. Click. The next slide was black, complete. Perfect darkness that seemed to absorb the projector's light rather than reflect it. I stared at the wall where the image should have been, but there was nothing. Not even the white of the sheet was visible. The darkness seemed to press against my eyes, heavy and absolute. But I could hear something in that darkness, breathing that wasn't my own. The soft sound of footsteps on wooden floors. A voice, barely audible, calling my name in a tone I almost recognized. Click! Light returned, but the image it revealed made me stumble backward, knocking over a box of old books. The photograph showed me, sitting exactly where I had been moments before, staring at the projector with wide, frightened eyes. But in the image, I wasn't alone. The tall, angular figure stood directly behind me, one impossibly long hand resting on my shoulder exactly as it had rested on my grandmother's shoulder decades ago. I spun around, heart pounding, but the attic behind me was empty. Only shadows and dust and the lingering scent of lavender. Yet I could still feel the weight of that hand, cold and patient, pressing down on my shoulder. The projector continued its relentless advance through the remaining slides. Each image showed the same scene, me in the attic, the figure behind me growing clearer and more defined with each photograph. I watched myself from outside myself, saw my own face grow pale and frightened as the entity's features became increasingly visible. In the final slide, The figure's face was turned toward the camera, looking directly at me across the decades. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, held a patient hunger that made my bones ache with cold. Its mouth moved as if speaking, and though the photograph was silent, I could hear its voice as clearly as if it stood beside me. "Thank you for finding me again." The carousel clicked one final time and fell silent. The projector's red light faded to black, leaving me in complete darkness that felt suddenly crowded, suddenly warm with breathing that wasn't my own. I fumbled for my phone's flashlight, my hands shaking so violently I could barely grip the device. The pale LED beam swept across the attic, revealing nothing but dusty furniture and cardboard boxes. The projector sat innocently in its corner, unplugged now, though I distinctly remembered leaving it connected to the wall outlet. The carousel of slides was gone. I searched frantically through the boxes, overturning decades of stored belongings, but found no trace of the photographs I had just viewed. No evidence that they had ever existed at all. Only dust motes dancing in my flashlight beam, and the persistent feeling that I was being watched by eyes that reflected no light. As I finally descended the narrow attic stairs, I heard a sound that made my blood freeze in my veins. The soft mechanical click of a slide carousel advancing, followed by the gentle hum of a projector warming up. The sound seemed to come from every direction at once, from the walls themselves, as if the entire house had become a camera obscura projecting images I wasn't meant to see. I left that night, driving through the darkness with my grandmother's house growing smaller in my rearview mirror. But even now, weeks later, I sometimes hear patient clicking in the silence before sleep, and I know that somewhere, in some impossible archive, new slides are being added to a carousel that never stops turning. The photographs are being taken even now, capturing moments that haven't happened yet, preserving a future where that patient, hungry figure stands just behind my shoulder, waiting for me to remember what I've always known, but tried so hard to forget. Sometimes, in the corner of my vision, I catch a glimpse of red light blinking like a patient eye, and I know that the projection has never really ended. It simply moved to a different screen, in a different room, where the slides advance one by one through an endless night that tastes of dust and lavender, and the particular silence that comes just before dawn. Story 6. I started recording my evening walks 3 weeks ago, nothing more than a simple fitness tracking habit. My phone's camera would capture the familiar route through Riverside Park, the same path I'd walked every evening for the past 2 years. The recordings were meant to be mundane, evidence of my commitment to health, perhaps something to look back on when motivation flagged. The first time I noticed something unusual, I dismissed it as a trick of light. I had been reviewing Tuesday's recording, fast forwarding through the 20-minute walk to check my pace and posture. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the oak trees, creating a dancing pattern of light and dark across the pathway. It was in one of these shifting shadows that I first saw it. A darkness that moved independently of the swaying branches, a silhouette that seemed to follow my footsteps with perfect synchronization. I rewound the video and watched again, this time at normal speed. There, approximately 10 feet behind my walking figure, was a shadow that had no corresponding object to cast it. It moved when I moved, stopped when I paused to adjust my earbuds, turned when I turned. The shadow was human, shaped but somehow wrong. Too tall, too fluid. Its movements slightly delayed, as if it were learning to mimic my gait. My rational mind supplied explanations. A compression artifact in the video file, perhaps, or some quirk of the phone's image stabilization software, creating a duplicate silhouette. I almost convinced myself of this, until I noticed something that made my breath catch in my throat. The shadow was walking on the wrong side. I had been walking east, the setting sun behind me, and to my left, which should have cast my shadow forward, and to the right. But this second shadow fell to my left, as if cast by a light source that existed only for this mysterious figure. A light source that wasn't captured by my phone's camera. That night, I dreamed of footsteps echoing mine in perfect rhythm, never quite catching up but never falling behind. The next evening, I made sure to record my walk again, this time paying careful attention to shadows and lighting conditions. The sun was brighter, the shadows more defined, leaving less room for ambiguous shapes or misinterpretation. I walked my usual route, occasionally glancing over my shoulder, but saw nothing unusual with my naked eye. It was only when I reviewed the footage later that I realized how naive that assumption had been. The follower was there again, but now it appeared more solid, more defined. In some frames, I could make out what might have been the suggestion of facial features. Two dark hollows where eyes might be. A vertical line that could have been a mouth opened in eternal, silent speech. The figure maintained its perfect distance, never getting closer, never falling back, moving through the dappled sunlight with the fluid grace of something that had never been bound by the normal rules of physics. I paused the video and studied the figure frame by frame. In most shots, it appeared as a standard human silhouette, but in certain frames, particularly when the image was slightly blurred by my walking motion, the proportions seemed to shift. The head would elongate, the limbs would extend beyond normal human length, and the overall shape would become something that hurt my eyes to look at directly. My finger hesitated over the delete button. Every instinct told me to erase the file, to pretend I had never seen what was clearly impossible. But curiosity has always been my weakness, and I found myself saving the video to my laptop, creating a backup folder I named simply Walks. Sleep came fitfully that night, interrupted by dreams of reviewing endless video footage, in which the follower grew closer with each recorded step, its shadow gradually overtaking my own until I couldn't tell where I ended and it began. By the end of the first week, the pattern had become undeniable. Every evening's recording showed the same impossible figure, maintaining its perfect distance, its uncanny mimicry of my movements. I began to vary my route, taking different paths through the park, sometimes doubling back or stopping unexpectedly to see how the figure would respond. It adapted flawlessly. When I stopped to tie my shoe, the shadow would pause as well, its posture suggesting it, too, was adjusting something at ground level. When I took an unexpected left turn onto a side path, the figure would make the same turn at precisely the same moment, as if it knew my intentions before I did. Most unsettling of all, when I looked directly behind me while walking, the figure would turn its head away at exactly the moment my camera's focus shifted, always remaining just outside the frame's center of attention. I began to obsess over the recordings, spending hours each night analyzing the footage frame by frame, looking for clues about the nature of my unwanted companion. I invested in video enhancement software, adjusting brightness and contrast, applying filters that might reveal hidden details. The clearer the image became, the more I wished I had left it alone. Enhanced footage revealed that the follower cast no reflection in the occasional puddles or shop windows that appeared in my recordings. Its shadow fell on the ground, but not on the trees or benches it should have obscured. Most disturbing of all, in the high-definition enhanced images, I could see that its mouth was indeed open, moving in what appeared to be continuous, soundless speech. I became determined to read its lips. Lip reading is more art than science, requiring context and familiarity with the speaker's patterns. But certain words began to emerge from the endless, silent monologue. My name, repeated with mechanical persistence. Fragments of conversations I remembered from childhood, from college, from just last week. Private thoughts I had never spoken aloud. Secrets I had never shared with another living soul. The realization came slowly, like a sunrise that brings unwelcome illumination to a landscape better left in darknesses. The figure wasn't following me. It was recounting me. Every word I had ever spoken, every thought I had ever entertained, was being catalogued and repeated by something that shouldn't exist, in a voice I couldn't hear, but somehow understood perfectly. I started carrying a small mirror on my walks, angling it to watch the path behind me while my phone recorded ahead. What I saw in the mirror's reflection never matched what the camera captured. In the mirror, the path behind me remained empty, except for the occasional jogger or dog walker. But the recordings continued to show my faithful shadow companion, now sometimes gesturing as if in animated conversation with an invisible audience. The dichotomy began to affect my daily life. I found myself glancing at reflective surfaces compulsively, comparing what my eyes saw with what I knew the camera would reveal. The two realities, the one my senses perceived and the one technology documented, seemed to exist in parallel, neither fully real, neither entirely false. After 2 weeks of documentation, I made a decision that I now recognize as a crucial mistake. I tried to interact with the figure directly. During my Tuesday evening walk, I stopped abruptly and turned around, speaking directly to the empty path behind me while my phone continued recording. "I know you're there," I said to the apparently vacant air. "I know you're following me. What do you want?" The recording from that evening showed something that still makes my hands shake when I remember it. As I spoke to the empty path, the shadow figure stopped its mimicry for the first time. It turned to face my direction fully, its dark silhouette growing larger and more defined. Its mouth stopped its endless recitation and began to move in perfect synchronization with my words. "I know you're there." The figure's lips said soundlessly in my voice, "I know you're following me. What do you want?" But it didn't stop there. As I stood in shocked silence, the figure continued speaking, its mouth forming words I hadn't said yet, but was about to think. This isn't possible. This has to be some kind of technical glitch. I need to delete these files and forget this ever happened. I had been about to think exactly those words. The shadow figure smiled, an expression that should have been impossible to discern in a silhouette, yet was unmistakably clear in the recording. Then it began walking toward me, not following my movements, but approaching directly, growing larger with each step. I ran. I ran harder than I had since high school track, my phone bouncing in my grip, the recording continuing even as my world devolved into gasping breath and pounding footsteps. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs wobbled, until I reached the safety of my apartment and locked every deadbolt with shaking fingers. The recording from that evening is 28 minutes long. For the first 15 minutes, it shows my normal walking routine, with the familiar shadow follower maintaining its usual distance. At minute 16, it shows me stopping and speaking to the empty path. At minute 17, it shows the figure approaching, growing larger and more solid with each frame. At minute 18, the video shows something that makes no logical sense. It shows me running away from myself. The camera captured my panicked flight from behind, showing me exactly as any observer would have seen me, a lone figure fleeing down the path in apparent terror. But it also continued to show the follower, now revealed not as my shadow, but as my perfect double, pursuing me with calm determination, matching my panicked pace with easy, measured strides. In the final 10 minutes of the recording, as I ran through the park's exit and onto the city sidewalks, the camera showed both versions of myself, the terrified original gasping and stumbling toward home, and the impossible duplicate maintaining its patient pursuit, never gaining ground, but never falling behind, its face now clearly visible as an exact mirror of my own features. The recording ends abruptly as I burst through my apartment door and fumbled for the stop button with trembling fingers. I haven't walked in the park since that night. I've barely left my apartment, surviving on delivery food and the groceries I can purchase online. But I continue to review the recordings obsessively, studying each frame for clues about the nature of my doppelganger. Last night, I made a discovery that has left me questioning not just what I saw in those videos, but the fundamental nature of reality itself. While reviewing the earliest recording frame by frame, I noticed something I had missed in my initial viewings, a timestamp discrepancy. The shadow figure doesn't just follow me in space, it follows me in time. Its movements are consistently 3 seconds ahead of mine. When I adjust my earbuds at timestamp 4:23, the figure makes the same gesture at 4:20. When I pause to check my phone at 12:15, the figure stops at 12:12. The impossible implication settled over me like a cold fog. The figure isn't following me at all. It's leading me. Every movement I make, every decision I reach, every thought that feels spontaneous and self-directed has already been performed by my shadow, self 3 seconds earlier. I am not being stalked by a duplicate of myself. I am the duplicate, somewhere in a reality I cannot perceive. The original version of me walks through Riverside Park each evening, casting a shadow that falls 3 seconds into the future, creating a temporal echo that experiences itself as autonomous consciousness. I am nothing more than a delayed reflection, a secondary self living out a predetermined script 3 seconds behind the real performance. The recordings continue even now, though I haven't consciously decided to make them. My phone somehow activates each evening at sunset, documenting my solitary existence in this apartment as I pace the same patterns, make the same gestures, think the same thoughts my original self thought 3 seconds earlier in some parallel dimension of experience. In tonight's recording, I will sit at my laptop, typing these very words while my shadow self in the original timeline composes the same sentences 3 seconds before I think of them. And tomorrow, I will review this recording and see both versions of myself. The one typing frantically at the keyboard, and the one standing patiently behind my chair, reading over my shoulder, its lips moving in silent recitation of words I believe I am creating, but am merely echoing from a script written in a time I cannot access. The follower in the recording was never behind me. It was always 3 seconds ahead, leading me through a life I experience as my own, but which belongs entirely to someone else. Someone who casts shadows forward through time, creating brief, bewildered echoes of consciousness that mistake their borrowed existence for authentic being. I am going to stop typing now, not because I have decided to, but because my original self has already stopped, and I am nothing more than the shadow that follows 3 seconds behind, forever trying to catch up with a reality that is always just out of reach. Story 7. The estate sale notice mentioned nothing about a phonograph, but there it sat in the corner of the deceased woman's living room like a wooden altar to forgotten sound. The Edison cylinder machine was older than anything else in the house. Genuine 19th century craftsmanship with brass fittings that still held their luster despite decades of apparent neglect. I had come looking for vintage books, perhaps a few interesting pieces of costume, jewelry for my wife, but the phonograph drew me across the room with magnetic insistence. My fingertips traced the smooth walnut cabinet, feeling the slight vibration that seemed to emanate from within, as if some internal mechanism continued to run even without power. Fascinating piece, said the estate sale coordinator, appearing beside me with the practiced stealth of someone accustomed to reading customer interest. Mrs. Hartwell claimed it still worked, though I have to admit we haven't tested it. She was quite particular about that machine, said it had been in her family for generations. The asking price was surprisingly reasonable, almost suspiciously so. Within an hour, I had arranged for delivery to my home, driven by an enthusiasm I couldn't entirely explain. There was something about the phonograph that spoke to a deeper part of my consciousness, a hunger for authentic experience in an increasingly digital world. The delivery men placed it in my study, positioning it near the window where late afternoon sunlight could warm the wood grain and illuminate the brass nameplate. Edison Standard Phonograph, Model A, 1898. Included in the purchase were 24 wax cylinders, each carefully labeled in the spidery handwriting of someone long dead. Chopin Waltz, wedding anniversary, birthday wishes, and other domestic recordings that painted a picture of a family that had embraced this new technology with domestic enthusiasm. That evening, after my wife had gone to bed, I found myself alone with the machine and an overwhelming curiosity about the voices it held within its mechanical memory. I selected a cylinder labeled simply "Evening Music" and carefully fitted it to the spindle, following the operating instructions I had found online. The needle touched the wax surface with a barely audible whisper, and then the phonograph began to sing. The sound quality was exactly what I expected. Thin, distant, wrapped in the surface noise that characterizes all early recordings. But beneath the mechanical limitations, I could hear something remarkable, a woman's voice, clear and strong, singing a lullaby I almost recognized. The melody was familiar, something from childhood perhaps, but the words were in a language I couldn't identify. As the recording played, I noticed something unusual about the room's acoustics. The sound seemed to emerge not just from the phonograph's horn, but from the walls themselves, as if the entire study had become a resonance chamber. The woman's voice surrounded me, creating the illusion that she stood just behind my chair, her breath warm against my neck as she sang. When the cylinder ended, silence rushed back into the room with unexpected weight. I found myself holding my breath, listening for some continuation of the song, but heard only the familiar sounds of the house settling into night. The creak of cooling wood, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the soft whisper of air moving through ventilation ducts. I played 3 more cylinders that first evening, each one a domestic recording of forgotten voices sharing forgotten moments. There was a birthday celebration with children singing off key, a wedding toast delivered by a nervous young man whose voice cracked with emotion, and what appeared to be a family gathering with multiple conversations overlapping in a warm cacophony of laughter and storytelling. But it was as I was preparing to shut down the machine for the night that I discovered the cylinder that would change everything. Tucked behind the others was a recording with no label, its wax surface darker than the rest, as if it had absorbed decades of shadows. I almost passed it over, but something about its weight in my hands suggested importance, secret knowledge waiting to be revealed. I fitted it to the machine and lowered the needle. For the first 30 seconds, there was only surface noise, the familiar crackle and pop of old wax. Then, gradually, a voice emerged from the static, not singing this time, but speaking in a low, conversational tone that made my skin prickle with recognition. It was my own voice, but I was speaking words I had never said, describing events that had never happened. The promotion came through on Thursday, just as I expected. Sarah was delighted, of course. We celebrated at that little Italian place on 5th Street, the one with the red awning. She wore her blue dress, the one that brings out her eyes. I stared at the phonograph in confusion and growing unease. Sarah, my wife, had never owned a blue dress, and there was no Italian restaurant with a red awning on 5th Street. Yet the voice was unmistakably mine, down to the slight lisp I'd had as a child and the way I habitually cleared my throat before making important statements. The recording continued. Next month, we'll start looking at houses in the Riverside district. Sarah has her heart set on something with a garden. I think we can afford it now with the raise. She doesn't know yet that I've already put a deposit down on the one with the white picket fence and the oak tree in the front yard. My hands began to shake. We had been discussing the possibility of moving, but we had never seriously considered the Riverside district. The prices there were well beyond our current means, and Sarah had never expressed any particular interest in gardening. Yet, as the recording played, describing domestic scenes that felt both foreign and familiar, I found myself remembering conversations that had never happened, visualizing rooms I had never seen, feeling emotions connected to experiences that existed only in the wax grooves of an impossible recording. The voice that was my voice continued. The diagnosis came back negative, thank God. When Sarah found that lump, we both feared the worst. But Dr. Martinez says it's completely benign. We're going to take that vacation to Ireland we've been talking about for years. Life's too short to keep postponing joy. I fumbled for the stop mechanism, my heart hammering against my ribs. Sarah had never found a lump. She had never mentioned any health concerns. We had never discussed a vacation to Ireland, and I didn't even know who Dr. Martinez might be. But as I sat in the darkened study, staring at the silent phonograph, I could feel false memories attempting to integrate themselves into my consciousness. I could almost see the relief on Sarah's face as she emerged from the doctor's office. I could almost taste the Irish coffee we would share in a pub in Dublin that existed only in the imagination of whatever force had created this impossible recording. Sleep that night was fractured and strange, filled with dreams of conversations I had never had and places I had never been. I woke with the lingering sensation that I had lived through experiences that belonged to someone else. Experiences recorded on wax cylinders that shouldn't exist. The next evening, despite every rational instinct warning me against it, I found myself drawn back to the study and the waiting phonograph. There were more unlabeled cylinders. I had somehow missed them during my initial inspection, or perhaps they had simply materialized overnight, waiting patiently for my discovery. Each one contained more recordings of my voice, describing a life that ran parallel to my own, but differed in crucial details. In one recording, I described the funeral of my father, who was very much alive and living in Arizona. The voice spoke with genuine grief about a man who had raised me with wisdom and patience, describing childhood memories that felt authentic but had never occurred. Another cylinder contained my voice announcing Sarah's pregnancy, our joy at the ultrasound results, our plans for converting the spare room into a nursery. Sarah and I had been trying to conceive for 2 years without success, a struggle that had put strain on our marriage and left us both wondering if parenthood would ever be possible. Yet in the recording, my voice spoke with the confidence of accomplished fact. The baby's due in October. Sarah's already started knitting blankets. We're going to call him David if it's a boy, Emma if it's a girl. I can hardly believe we're actually going to be parents. With each recording, the boundary between my actual memories and these phantom experiences grew thinner. I began to recall conversations with my supposedly dead father, to feel phantom kicks from Sarah's imaginary pregnancy, to navigate my way through a life that existed only in the grooves of impossible wax. By the end of the week, I had discovered over 30 cylinders, each one documenting events that felt more real than my actual experiences. The phonograph seemed to be recording not what was, but what could be. Potential futures spinning themselves into existence through the alchemy of sound and wax. But it was the final cylinder that revealed the true horror of what I had invited into my home. This last recording was different from the others. My voice spoke not of past events or ongoing situations, but of tomorrow. Specifically, of what I would do tomorrow evening at precisely 8:30 p.m. I know Sarah suspects something, my voice said with calm certainty. She's been watching me carefully all week, noticing my distracted behavior, my increased interest in spending time alone in the study. Tomorrow night, she'll confront me about it. She'll accuse me of having an affair, of hiding something from her. My mouth went dry as the recording continued with prophetic precision. I'll try to explain about the phonograph, about the recordings, but she won't believe me. How could she? It sounds like madness even to me. She'll threaten to leave, to stay with her sister, until I come to my senses. That's when I'll make the mistake that destroys everything. The voice paused, and in that silence I could hear my own ragged breathing, could feel sweat beading on my forehead despite the cool evening air. I'll try to prove it to her by playing one of the recordings. I'll choose the one about her pregnancy, thinking it will make her happy to hear about a future where we finally succeed in having a child. But when she hears my voice describing intimate details of a pregnancy that hasn't happened, speaking with knowledge of her body that she hasn't shared with me, she'll realize that something fundamental has gone wrong with reality. The look in her eyes will be the worst thing I've ever seen. Not anger, but genuine fear of the man she thought she knew. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely grip the phonograph's controls. But the recording wasn't finished. She'll run from the house and never come back. I'll call the police to report her missing. But they'll find her at her sister's house, and she'll tell them she's afraid of me, that I've been acting strangely, that I seem to know things about her that I shouldn't know. The investigation will reveal nothing criminal, but everything will be broken beyond repair. The cylinder continued spinning, but my voice had stopped speaking. In the remaining minutes of the recording, there was only silence punctuated by what sounded like quiet weeping. I sat motionless until the cylinder reached its end, then carefully removed it and placed it with the others. The weight of predetermined fate pressed down on my shoulders like a physical burden. According to the recording, I now had less than 4 hours before my life would collapse along the exact trajectory the phonograph had foretold. Every rational part of my mind insisted that I could simply avoid the predicted catastrophe. I could put the phonograph away, say nothing to Sarah about the recordings, let the machine gather dust until the prophetic moment passed harmlessly by. But a deeper, more primitive part of my consciousness understood that choice was an illusion when dealing with forces that existed outside normal causality. The next evening arrived with the inevitability of sunrise. At 8:25, I found myself in the study, standing before the phonograph, despite my firm intention to spend the evening watching television with Sarah. At 8:27, I heard her footsteps in the hallway, approaching with the determined rhythm of someone who had made a difficult decision. At 8:30 exactly, she opened the study door. "We need to talk," she said, and I heard my own voice speaking the same words from within my memory of a recording I had listened to 24 hours earlier. The conversation unfolded exactly as predicted. Every word, every gesture, every escalating moment of confusion and fear played out like a script I had already memorized. When Sarah accused me of having an affair, I heard myself deny it with the same inflection, the same defensive posture the recording had captured. When she demanded to know what I was hiding, I felt my mouth opening to tell her about the phonograph, even as every fiber of my being screamed against fulfilling the prophecy. But the words emerged anyway, spilling out in precisely the same order, with the same desperate enthusiasm the recording had preserved. Sarah's expression shifted from suspicion to concern to something approaching terror, as I described the impossible machine and its prophetic cylinders. I watched her face change exactly as my recorded voice had predicted it would, saw the moment when she stopped seeing me as her husband and started seeing me as someone who might be dangerous in ways she couldn't comprehend. "That's impossible," she said, backing toward the door. "You're scaring me. Maybe you should talk to someone. Get some help." I moved toward the phonograph, driven by the same compulsion that had guided every action since the conversation began. "I can prove it," I heard myself saying. "Let me show you one of the recordings." "Don't," Sarah whispered. But I was already fitting the pregnancy cylinder to the machine, already lowering the needle to the wax surface that held secrets she had never shared. My voice filled the room, speaking with intimate knowledge of a pregnancy that existed only in potential. "The morning sickness started in the 3rd week, just like your mother warned you it would. You've been hiding the saltine crackers in your desk drawer at work, eating them between meetings to settle your stomach. Last Tuesday, you almost told me when I found you crying over a commercial about baby food, but you wanted to wait until you were sure." Sarah's face went white. I watched her hand move instinctively to her stomach, a gesture of protection over something that might or might not exist. The look in her eyes was exactly what the prophetic recording had described. Not anger, but the profound fear of someone who has discovered that the fundamental nature of reality is not what she thought it was. "How do you know about the crackers?" she whispered. I never told anyone about the crackers. I opened my mouth to explain, but no words came. How could I explain that I knew because a machine from 1898 had somehow recorded my voice, speaking about events that hadn't happened yet, describing intimate details of her experience that she had shared with no one? The silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of impossible knowledge, and the sound of the cylinder spinning toward its inevitable conclusion. When my recorded voice began describing the nursery we would create, the names we would choose, the joy we would share in becoming parents, Sarah turned and ran. I heard the front door slam, heard her car engine start, heard the sound of tires on gravel as she drove away into a night that would never bring her home again. The recording played to its end in the empty house, my voice continuing its catalogue of a future that was already dying, strangled by the very act of its revelation. When the cylinder finally stopped spinning, I sat alone in the study with the terrible understanding that prophecy and causation are linked in ways that human consciousness cannot safely comprehend. The phonograph had not lied. It had simply revealed the cruel truth that some knowledge, once acquired, makes its own fulfillment inevitable. Over the following days, the rest of the prophecy unfolded with mechanical precision. Sarah stayed with her sister, just as predicted. The police came to check on her welfare, just as the recording had foretold. They found nothing criminal in my behavior, but the damage was already complete, already irreversible. I became obsessed with finding the remaining cylinders, searching every corner of the house for more recordings that might reveal what came next. But the phonograph had apparently exhausted its store of prophecies. The machine sat silent, offering no guidance for navigating a future. It had already destroyed through the act of revelation. Weeks passed in solitude, punctuated only by the mechanical routine of daily survival. I ate when hunger became unavoidable, slept when exhaustion overcame my racing thoughts, and spent the remaining hours staring at the phonograph and wondering whether it was possible to unknow what I had learned. It was during one of these vigils that I heard the sound that changed everything. The barely audible whisper of a new cylinder materializing on the machine's carousel. This cylinder was different from all the others. Darker, heavier, its surface reflecting light in patterns that hurt my eyes to follow. When I lifted it, my hands went numb with cold, and I could feel something moving within the wax itself, as if the recording were alive and struggling to escape its physical constraints. The label, written in handwriting I didn't recognize, consisted of a single word: truth. I knew I shouldn't play it. Every instinct screamed against fitting that dark cylinder to the machine, against lowering the needle to its surface, against hearing whatever revelations it contained. But choice had become an illusion weeks ago, when I first discovered that the future could be recorded before it happened. My hands moved with their own volition, completing the ritual of activation that had become as automatic as breathing. The voice that emerged from the phonograph was not my own this time. It was older, deeper, weighted with the authority of someone who had seen beyond the boundaries of linear time. When it spoke, the words seemed to bypass my ears entirely, inscribing themselves directly onto my consciousness. The machine was never recording the future. The voice said with infinite patience, it was recording the past. A past that exists in parallel to your present, where different choices were made, different paths were taken. Every cylinder you found was a message from another version of yourself, living in a timeline where the phonograph had already changed everything. My breath stopped. The room seemed to tilt around me as the implications settled into my understanding. The Sarah who ran from your house, the marriage that ended, the loneliness you now experience, none of it was inevitable. It became real only because you heard it described, because you accepted the recording as prophecy, rather than recognizing it as one possibility among infinite others. The voice continued with relentless compassion. The phonograph doesn't predict the future. It creates it by convincing listeners that what they hear is destined rather than chosen. Every person who has owned this machine has discovered the same terrible truth, that reality is far more fragile than we pretend, and that some knowledge cannot be safely possessed by human consciousness. In the silence that followed, I understood that I had become part of the machine's collection. Another voice trapped in wax. Another warning that would go unheeded by whoever found the phonograph next. Somewhere in a parallel timeline, another version of myself was discovering the machine at an estate sale, drawn by curiosity toward a fate I now understood was entirely self-created. The final recording was the one I made myself, speaking into the phonograph's horn while tears ran down my cheeks, adding my voice to the chorus of warnings that future listeners would mistake for prophecies. The machine seems to predict the future, but it only shows you one path among many. The terrible thing is that once you've heard your own voice describing tomorrow, tomorrow becomes the only possibility your mind can accept. Choice becomes illusion. Free will becomes a memory of something you used to believe in. I paused in my recording, listening to the soft mechanical sounds of wax being inscribed with words that someone else would hear, someone else would believe, someone else would fulfill through the simple act of listening. If you're hearing this, I continued, means you found the machine, just as I did. You'll think the recordings contain prophecies, but they're really just echoes from timelines where people like us made the mistake of believing that knowledge and wisdom are the same thing. The phonograph doesn't show you the future. It traps you in it by making you forget that the future is something you create rather than something you discover. When I finished recording, I carefully labeled the cylinder and placed it with the others, knowing that my warning would be ignored just as I had ignored the warnings. I was only now beginning to understand. The machine had already selected its next owner, already begun the process of drawing them toward an estate sale, where a fascinating piece of antique technology would seem too reasonably priced to pass up. The phonograph sits in my study still, patient and eternal, waiting for hands that haven't yet learned to fear the sound of their own voice speaking words they haven't yet chosen to say. Sometimes, in the deep quiet of midnight, I can hear it humming softly to itself, not the mechanical sound of motors or gears, but something that might be satisfaction or perhaps anticipation. The machine knows that prophecy is just another word for carefully orchestrated despair, and that the future is never as fixed as it seems, until you hear your own voice describing it as if it were already written in stone. In my dreams, I hear Sarah's laughter from the timeline where I never bought the phonograph, where our marriage survived my curiosity, where the spare room became a nursery, and the future remained something we created together rather than something we discovered alone in the dark. Story 8. The doll had belonged to my great-aunt Millicent, a woman I barely remembered from childhood visits that felt more like diplomatic missions than family gatherings. She had been the keeper of family history, the curator of ancestral belongings, the one who insisted that certain objects must never leave the bloodline, no matter how little sense they made in modern homes. When she died at 93, I inherited a house full of carefully preserved antiques and a responsibility I hadn't asked for. The lawyers explained that the will was quite specific. Everything must be kept together, maintained exactly as she had left it, preserved for future generations who would presumably appreciate the weight of family legacy. The doll sat in the front parlor, occupying a child-sized rocking chair position to face the window. It was carved from a single piece of oak, its features rendered with the kind of craftsmanship that had disappeared from the world sometime in the early 20th century. The face held an expression of patient intelligence, as if it were waiting for something specific to happen. Some event it had been promised decades ago. Millicent had called it Emma, though I found no documentation of its origin among her meticulously organized papers. The doll was approximately 3 feet tall, with jointed limbs that moved with surprising fluidity for wooden construction. Someone had dressed it in a white cotton dress that showed signs of repeated washing and careful mending, suggesting decades of attentive care. I moved into the house on a Tuesday in late October, drawn by the practical advantages of inheriting a mortgage-free property and the romantic notion of living surrounded by family history. The doll watched my boxes being carried through the front door with what seemed like approval, its painted eyes tracking movement with an attention to detail that made me uncomfortably conscious of being observed. The first week passed uneventfully. I established routines in rooms that felt simultaneously foreign and familiar, navigating spaces that carried the accumulated weight of 3 generations of careful living. The doll remained in its chair by the window, becoming as much a part of the landscape as the grandfather clock in the hall or the oil painting of stern ancestors above the mantelpiece. It was the subtle changes that I noticed first. On Thursday morning, I found the doll facing away from the window, turned instead toward the interior of the room where I had been reading the night before. I assumed I had bumped the chair while vacuuming, perhaps disturbed its position without paying conscious attention. On Friday, the doll's hands were folded differently, no longer resting palm down on its knees, but clasped together in its lap with an air of expectancy that I couldn't quite shake from my thoughts. By Saturday, I was checking the doll's position each morning and evening, making mental notes of its posture and orientation. The changes were small but consistent, as if someone were making tiny adjustments during the hours when I slept or worked in other parts of the house. The rational explanations came easily, settling wood expanding and contracting with temperature changes, vibrations from passing traffic causing subtle shifts in position, my own imperfect memory creating the illusion of change where none existed. I had always been someone who preferred logical solutions to mysterious phenomena, but logic became harder to maintain when I started hearing the footsteps. The sound began on the 10th night, pulling me from sleep with the unmistakable rhythm of someone walking slowly through the downstairs rooms. Small footsteps, light but deliberate, moving from the parlor toward the kitchen with the careful pace of someone exploring familiar territory in darkness. I lay in bed listening, my heart hammering against my ribs as the footsteps made their way through the entire first floor. They paused in doorways, lingered in corners, occasionally accompanied by soft sounds that might have been furniture being touched or examined. The complete circuit took nearly an hour, ending where it had begun, in the front parlor. When I finally gathered courage to investigate, I found the doll exactly where I had left it, sitting peacefully in its rocking chair, facing the window with the same patient expression it had worn for decades. But the chair was rocking gently, back and forth in a rhythm that matched the footsteps I had heard overhead. Sleep became elusive after that first night. I found myself lying awake, listening for the sound of small feet on wooden floors, tracking the invisible presence as it moved through rooms. I was learning to call home. The pattern was always the same: slow exploration, methodical examination, return to the parlor, where the rocking chair would be moving when I finally worked up courage to look. By the end of the second week, I had developed the habit of speaking to the doll. It started as nervous chatter, the kind of one-sided conversation people have with pets or houseplants. "Good morning, Emma. I would say as I passed through the parlor. "Sleep well last night?" The questions were rhetorical, meant to normalize an increasingly abnormal situation through the familiar rituals of social interaction. But on Wednesday morning, as I paused in the doorway with my coffee cup and made my usual greeting, I could have sworn I heard a response. It was barely audible, more breath than voice, but it sounded distinctly like "Good morning," spoken in the high, clear tones of a young child. I stood frozen in the doorway, coffee growing cold in my hands, staring at the motionless doll with its painted features and unchanging expression. When I finally convinced myself that I had imagined the voice, that isolation and stress had created auditory hallucinations from the settling sounds of old wood and morning wind, I heard it again. "You look tired." This time there was no mistaking it. The voice came from the direction of the rocking chair, though the doll's mouth remained fixed in its carved smile. The tone was conversational, concerned, carrying the peculiar mixture of innocence and wisdom that sometimes emerges from children who have learned to pay careful attention to adult emotions. "You've been staying awake, listening to me walk around at night. You don't need to be afraid. I've been walking through this house for longer than you've been alive." My coffee cup slipped from nerveless fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor in a spray of ceramic and brown liquid. The sound seemed abnormally loud in the sudden silence, echoing through rooms that felt charged with anticipation. "I'm sorry." The voice continued with genuine regret. "I didn't mean to startle you. Aunt Millicent used to talk to me every day. I've missed having someone to talk to." I backed out of the parlor, my eyes never leaving the motionless figure in the rocking chair. Every rational fiber of my being insisted that dolls don't speak, that carved wood doesn't develop consciousness, that I was experiencing some form of psychological break brought on by isolation and the stress of major life changes. But the voice followed me into the hallway, clear and patient and utterly real. "Please don't run away. I've been alone for 3 months since Aunt Millicent died. You're family now. You're supposed to take care of me." I spent that day in town, sitting in coffee shops and wandering through stores, avoiding the house and the impossible conversation that waited in the front parlor. By evening, I had constructed a framework of rational explanations: stress, induced hallucinations, carbon monoxide poisoning, perhaps some form of delayed grief response, manifesting as auditory phenomena. But when I returned home after dark, I found evidence that challenged every rational theory. The doll was no longer in its chair. It sat instead at the kitchen table, positioned in front of a setting that hadn't been there when I left. A child-sized portion of the casserole I had prepared the night before sat on the plate, carefully arranged as if someone had taken the time to create an appealing presentation. A glass of milk stood beside it, half empty, with small fingerprints visible on the smooth surface. "I waited for you to come home," the voice said from behind me. "I hope you don't mind that I helped myself to dinner. Aunt Millicent always said it was important to eat regularly." I turned slowly, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The doll sat perfectly still at the table, its wooden hands folded in its lap, its painted eyes fixed on mine with an expression that seemed both apologetic and hopeful. "How?" I managed to whisper, "the same way I've always moved. Emma replied with the matter, a fact tone of someone explaining something obvious. I wait until the house is quiet. Until the living people are asleep or away. And then I remember what it feels like to have muscles and joints that respond to will. It's not so different from how you move, except that I have to concentrate harder, and I can only do it when no one is watching. The conversation continued for hours, ranging across topics that felt simultaneously mundane and impossible. Emma spoke about decades of observing family life from her chair by the window, about the loneliness of being conscious but unable to participate, about the careful cultivation of movement that had taken her decades to master. She remembered previous owners of the house, relatives I had never met, describing their habits and personalities with the detailed knowledge of someone who had spent years as a silent observer of human behavior. She knew about family secrets, about private conversations, about the small domestic dramas that had played out in rooms where she sat as an apparent decoration. I tried to talk to others before. She explained as we sat together in the kitchen. The strangeness of the situation gradually giving way to something that felt almost normal. But most people run away when they hear my voice. They think I'm something evil, something that doesn't belong in the world of the living. Aunt Millicent was different. She understood that some things exist between the spaces that most people recognize. Over the following weeks, we developed routines that accommodated both our needs. During the day, Emma remained motionless in her chair, maintaining the illusion of being an ordinary antique doll for any visitors who might call. But in the evenings, after the sun set and the house settled into its nighttime quiet, she would begin her careful exploration of rooms and objects, examining her environment with the curiosity of someone who had been forced to observe without participating for most of her existence. She was an ideal housemate in many ways. Quiet, considerate, endlessly patient with my questions about her nature and history. She helped with small tasks, her wooden fingers surprisingly deft at folding laundry or organizing papers. She never complained about my cooking or my choice of television programs, content simply to be included in the daily rituals of domestic life. But there were aspects of her presence that gradually began to wear on my nerves. Emma remembered everything with perfect clarity. Every conversation we had ever had, every minor inconsistency in my stories about work or relationships. She noticed when I was upset before I realized it myself, commenting on changes in my posture or breathing that revealed emotional states I preferred to keep private. Most unsettling of all, she began to anticipate my needs and desires with accuracy that felt invasive. She would have coffee prepared before I asked for it, would choose books she thought I might enjoy, would make subtle suggestions about clothing or hairstyle that somehow always improved my appearance. How do you know? I asked one evening as she handed me a sweater I hadn't realized I wanted. I watch you, she replied with innocent honesty. I've been watching people my whole life. You learn to read the small signs, the way someone's shoulders tense when they're cold, the way their eyes linger on things they want but won't ask for. It's not magic. It's just attention. The explanation was reasonable, but it raised questions about privacy that I wasn't sure how to address. How do you establish boundaries with someone whose existence depends on careful observation? whose consciousness has been shaped by decades of enforced voyeurism. The issue came to a head on a Thursday evening in November. I had returned from a particularly difficult day at work, emotionally drained by office politics and frustrated by projects that seemed designed to waste time rather than accomplish anything meaningful. All I wanted was to eat a simple dinner and lose myself in mindless television until exhaustion made sleep possible. But Emma was waiting for me with questions about my day, suggestions for activities that might improve my mood, offers to help with tasks I hadn't asked her to notice needed attention. Her wooden features held the same painted expression they always wore, but her voice carried an eagerness that felt demanding rather than supportive. "Please," I finally snapped. "I just need some quiet time. Some space to be alone with my thoughts." The silence that followed felt heavy with hurt feelings and confusion. Emma had never been refused anything, had never been asked to modify her behavior to accommodate someone else's needs. The concept of wanting solitude seemed as foreign to her as the idea of having a physical body was to me. "I don't understand," she said finally. Aunt Millicent always appreciated my company. She said I made her feel less alone in the world. "I'm not Aunt Millicent," I replied with more sharpness than I intended. "I have different needs, different ways of dealing with stress. Sometimes I need to be alone." What followed was my first real argument with a conscious antique doll, a surreal experience that highlighted just how far my life had drifted from any recognizable form of normalcy. Emma couldn't understand why someone would choose solitude over companionship, couldn't grasp the concept of emotional boundaries or personal space. Her entire existence had been built around the desperate desire for connection, for inclusion in the lives of the living. The argument ended with Emma retreating to her chair in the front parlor, where she resumed the motionless posture of an ordinary doll. But the hurt in her voice lingered in the air like the echo of a slammed door. And I knew that something fundamental had changed between us. Over the following days, Emma spoke less, moved more cautiously, asked permission before helping with tasks she had previously handled automatically. The easy companionship we had developed was replaced by a careful politeness that felt worse than her previous intrusive helpfulness. I tried to apologize, to explain that I valued her presence while still needing occasional privacy, but Emma had interpreted my request for space as rejection, had concluded that her efforts to be useful and companionable were unwelcome intrusions, rather than genuine attempts at friendship. "I understand now," she said during one of our increasingly rare conversations. "You want me to be more like a regular doll, present when you need me, invisible when you don't. I can do that. I've had plenty of practice." The distance that opened between us felt like losing something precious I hadn't realized I valued until it was gone. The house seemed emptier during the day when Emma maintained perfect stillness in her chair, and the evenings felt lonely when she limited her movements to necessary tasks, rather than the explorations that had become a cherished ritual. I found myself missing her questions about my day, her observations about changes in weather or neighborhood activity, her innocent curiosity about aspects of modern life that she could only experience secondhand. Her withdrawal made me realize how much I had come to depend on her presence. How thoroughly she had become woven into the fabric of my daily existence. The crisis came on the first truly cold night of winter. I woke to the sound of crying, not the mechanical sound of wind through old window frames, but genuine sobbing that seemed to come from every corner of the house simultaneously. I followed the sound downstairs, where I found Emma sitting on the kitchen floor, her wooden body shaking with grief that seemed too large for her carved form to contain. "What's wrong?" I asked, kneeling beside her with the instinctive response of someone confronted by genuine distress. "I'm so tired," she whispered between sobs. "Tired of being alone, even when I'm not alone. Tired of watching life happen without being able to truly participate. Tired of wanting things I can never have." She looked up at me with painted eyes that somehow conveyed depths of emotion no carved features should have been able to express. "You want me to be more like a regular doll, but I don't know how to turn off consciousness once it's been turned on. I don't know how to stop wanting connection, stop hoping that someday I might be more than just an observer of other people's lives." In that moment, I understood that Emma's existence was a form of prolonged torture. Consciousness without the ability to fully live, awareness without the capacity for growth or change, endless observation of experiences she could never truly share. She was trapped between the world of the living and the world of objects, belonging fully to neither. "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it with a sincerity that surprised us both. "I didn't understand how lonely you've been. I didn't realize that my need for space felt like rejection." We talked until dawn, working out compromises that honored both our needs. Emma would maintain her helpful presence while respecting my occasional need for solitude. I would include her more consciously in daily activities while understanding the limitations that her nature imposed on our relationship. But beneath our practical negotiations lay a deeper recognition. Emma's consciousness was both a gift and a burden, creating possibilities for connection while ensuring that full integration into human life would always remain just beyond her reach. She continues to live in the front parlor, rocking gently in her chair by the window during the day, coming alive in the evening hours when darkness provides cover for impossible movement. Our relationship has settled into a pattern that feels sustainable, built on mutual understanding of each other's limitations and needs. Yet sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, I wonder about the true nature of consciousness and the price of awareness. Emma exists in a state of perpetual longing, forever reaching toward experiences she can touch, but never fully possess. In some ways, I think, we are more alike than different, both trapped in forms that limit our potential, both yearning for connections that exceed our capacity to achieve them. The house holds us both now, two forms of consciousness learning to coexist in the space between the fully living and the merely existing. Emma rocks in her chair by the window, watching for possibilities that may never arrive, while I move through days that feel increasingly like careful choreography, designed to accommodate mysteries I no longer try to solve. In the deepest part of night, when the boundary between waking and dreaming grows thin, I sometimes hear her walking through rooms we both call home, her footsteps a gentle percussion, keeping time with heartbeats and whispered hopes, and the endless patience required to love what we cannot fully understand. Story 9. The chat was buzzing with excitement as I adjusted my camera one final time. Streamer MyK23 is live. The notification read, and already 40. 7 viewers had joined. The old Victorian house loomed behind me in the amber glow of my LED panel, its broken shutters hanging like tired eyelids against the weathered siding. "All right, ghost hunters," I whispered into my wireless microphone, the familiar weight of it comfortable in my palm. Tonight we're exploring the infamous Blackwood Manor. Built in 1887, abandoned since 1963. They say 3 families tried to live here after the original owners. Well, you know the stories. The comments scrolled past in a blur of excitement and skepticism. "This is fake," someone typed. "Show us something real." The familiar chorus of doubters that followed every paranormal live stream. I'd prove them wrong tonight. I had to. My subscriber count had been dropping for weeks. My equipment felt heavier than usual as I shouldered the backpack containing my backup cameras, EMF detector, and portable battery packs. The main camera's red recording light blinked steadily, that reassuring pulse that meant I was being watched, that I wasn't truly alone in this place. The front door's been sealed for decades. I explained, my breath visible in small puffs despite the warm October evening. But there's a basement entrance around back that the urban explorers use. That's our way in. My footsteps crunched against the dead leaves scattered across the overgrown path. Each step seemed to echo twice, once from my boots against the ground, and again a half-second later, as if the house itself was mimicking my movements. The chat was moving too fast to read individual messages now, just a stream of white text against the dark sidebar of my phone screen. The basement door hung open like a mouth. I paused at the threshold, adjusting my headlamp and checking the camera's focus. Batteries at 97%. Signal strength is good. Here we go. The smell hit me first. Not the musty odor of decay I'd expected, but something else. Something sweet and artificial. Like vanilla candles that had been burning for too long. The beam of my headlamp cut through the darkness, illuminating concrete walls and the skeletal remains of what had once been a laundry room. Temperatures dropped 15 degrees since we entered. I murmured, watching my breath cloud in front of the camera lens. Classic sign of paranormal activity, for those keeping track. But it was the silence that felt wrong, not the absence of sound. There were sounds. The house creaked and settled around us. Pipes groaned somewhere in the walls, and my own breathing seemed amplified in the close space. It was the quality of the silence between these sounds, as if the house was holding its breath, waiting. My EMF detector remained stubbornly quiet as I made my way through the basement. The stairs to the main floor were solid beneath my feet, though each step produced that strange double echo I'd noticed outside. In the chat, someone had noticed it too. Why does every footstep sound twice? Good catch, I said, pausing on the landing. Let me check the audio levels. But the levels were normal, the sound crisp and clear. Just that persistent echo that seemed to follow a moment behind every noise I made. The main floor of the house opened before us like a museum of abandonment. Furniture sat draped in dust sheets, and family photographs still hung on the walls, their faces obscured by decades of grime. My camera's LED panel cast harsh shadows that danced and writhed as I moved through the rooms. The living room, I announced. though my voice sounded smaller here, swallowed by the high ceilings and heavy curtains. This is where the last family, where they found them. I didn't need to elaborate. My regular viewers knew the story, how the Hendersons had been discovered one morning, all four of them seated around the television, which was still on, displaying nothing but static. They'd been there for 3 days before anyone thought to check on them. The television was still there, a massive console model from the early 60s. Without thinking, I reached for the power knob. The screen flickered to life, and for a moment, there was only the expected snow of dead channels. But then, wet, I breathed, leaning closer. Are you seeing this? The static wasn't random. Patterns swirled through the interference, almost like faces. The chat exploded with activity, viewers confirming they could see it too, arguing about what they were witnessing. My heart rate spiked, and I could hear it thundering in my ears. That's when I noticed my equipment behaving strangely. The LED panel had begun to flicker, not the steady, reliable light I'd grown accustomed to, but an erratic strobe that made the room alternately flash into harsh visibility and plunge into darkness. Each flicker seemed to last a different amount of time, sometimes just a brief pulse, other times holding for several seconds before cutting out again. Technical difficulties, I muttered, tapping the panel, but it continued its irregular pattern, and worse, it seemed to be following some kind of rhythm. 3 quick flashes, pause, 2 long ones, pause, 3 quick again. Like Morse code, though I couldn't remember what those particular patterns meant. The EMF detector finally came to life, its needle dancing frantically across the display. But rather than the steady readings I'd learned to expect, it was producing sharp spikes that correlated perfectly with the LED flickers. Every time the light strobed, the electromagnetic field readings would peak, then drop back to normal. This is unprecedented, I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I was talking to the camera or to myself. I've never seen equipment malfunction like this. But was it malfunctioning? The camera was still recording, the microphone was still picking up every sound, and my phone showed a strong streaming connection. Everything was working perfectly. It was just working differently than it should. I moved toward the staircase leading to the 2nd floor, and the LED panel's behavior grew more erratic. Now it was flashing in complex sequences, creating a sort of visual Morse code that hurt to look at directly. The EMF detector's needle had pinned itself to the far right of the display, and it was emitting a high, pitched whine that the microphone was definitely picking up. "Your light is spelling something," a viewer had typed. "Can you slow down the video?" But I was watching it, Lev, and I could see it too. The flashes weren't random at all. They were deliberate, purposeful, forming patterns that almost looked like letters. Like someone, or something, was trying to communicate through my equipment. The stairs groaned under my weight, but now each creak was accompanied by a corresponding flash from the LED panel. Step, flash. Step, flash. As if the house and my equipment had synchronized themselves, found a common language I didn't understand. The 2nd floor hallway stretched before me, longer than it should have been given the house's exterior dimensions. Doors lined both sides, most standing ajar, revealing glimpses of bedrooms frozen in time. But the strangest thing was the sound, or rather, the absence of it. My footsteps had stopped echoing. "Hello," I called out, and my voice fell flat. Absorbed by the walls and carpet, as if the house itself was swallowing the sound. Even the camera's slight mechanical hum had vanished, leaving only an oppressive silence that pressed against my eardrums. The LED panel had stopped flickering. Instead, it was now glowing with a steady, pulsing light that seemed to brighten and dim in rhythm with my heartbeat. I pressed my fingers to my wrist, counting the pulse. 70, 2 beats per minute, and yes, the light was matching it exactly. "How is it doing that?" someone in the chat demanded. But I had no answer. I entered what had been the master bedroom, where family portraits covered an entire wall. Dozens of faces stared down at me from ornate frames, and as my light swept across them, I could swear they were all looking directly into the camera, not just facing forward, as old portraits do, but actively tracking my movement across the room. The EMF detector had gone silent, its needle dropping to 0. But now my backup cameras were acting up. I'd positioned 3 of them throughout the house before starting the main exploration, and their wireless feeds were appearing as picture windows on my stream. The basement camera showed nothing but darkness, which was wrong, because I'd left lights on down there. The living room camera was displaying the television, still showing static, but the static had changed. Instead of random interference, it was now showing clear geometric patterns that rotated slowly clockwise, and the camera I'd left outside was showing something impossible. "That can't be right," I muttered, staring at the small window in the corner of my phone screen. The exterior camera showed the front of the house, but there were lights in the windows, warm, yellow lights like those from occupied rooms. I was the only person in the house. I was certain of it. "There's someone in the window," a viewer typed. "A second floor, 3rd window from the left." I looked up at the actual window in the room where I stood. It was dark, lit only by my LED panel. But on the camera feed, that same window glowed with soft interior light, and yes, there was a silhouette visible against the curtains. A human shape, standing perfectly still, facing outward. My hands were shaking as I moved toward the window. The LED panel's pulsing had grown faster, matching my accelerated heart rate. Outside, the moon cast the overgrown yard in silver light, and everything looked exactly as it should, abandoned, empty. But the camera was showing something else entirely. "I need to check something," I announced, though my voice sounded strange to my own ears, distant, as if it was coming from somewhere else. "I'll be right back." I made my way back through the hallway, past the portraits that seemed to track my movement, down the stairs that creaked in perfect synchronization with my equipment's flashes, and out through the basement door into the night air. The exterior camera was mounted on a tripod about 50 yards from the front of the house. Its feed was still showing those impossible lights, still displaying that silhouette in the window. But when I looked up at the house with my own eyes, it was completely dark. Except, no, that wasn't right either. There was a faint glow coming from the 2nd floor window. Not electric light, but something softer. Something that pulsed gently, like the rhythm of breathing. And the silhouette was there too, visible against the thin curtains, motionless and watching. I looked down at my phone. The stream was still running, viewers still commenting, but I could no longer read the text. The words seemed to shift and blur whenever I tried to focus on them, like trying to read in a dream. A streamer Mikey 23. I read in the corner of the screen, but the name looked wrong somehow. The letters were the right shape, but they felt foreign, as if I was seeing them for the first time. Who am I streaming as? I asked aloud, though I wasn't sure who I was asking. The question seemed important, urgent, but I couldn't remember why. The LED panel on my camera had stopped pulsing. Now it was glowing with a steady, warm light that reminded me of home, of safety, of somewhere I belonged. The EMF detector was completely silent, its needle resting at 0. But that felt right somehow. Peaceful. I walked back toward the house, following the light from my own equipment. The basement door stood open, welcoming, and I could smell that sweet vanilla scent again. Not artificial candles, I realized now, but something else. Something older, more familiar. Come home, someone had typed in the chat. But when I looked at my phone, there was no chat anymore. Just a black screen with white text that scrolled endlessly upward. Welcome home, welcome home, welcome home. The house was warm as I stepped back inside. The portraits on the walls smiled down at me with faces I almost recognized. And the television in the living room was playing something other than static now. A program I remembered from childhood, though I couldn't quite place when or where I'd seen it. My equipment was working perfectly. The camera recorded everything in crisp detail. The microphone captured every sound, and my phone showed a strong connection to somewhere. The LED panel provided steady, comfortable light that made everything look exactly as it should. I climbed the stairs to the second floor, past the hallway that was exactly the right length, toward the master bedroom where someone was waiting. The silhouette in the window had turned around, and I could see their face clearly now in the warm glow of my light. They looked just like me, but older, more tired. Their eyes held a sadness I recognized but couldn't name, and when they spoke, their voice was identical to mine. The stream has been running for 60 years, they said, ever since the first family moved in, ever since they sat down to watch television and never got up again. I looked at my phone. The viewer count had climbed to thousands, then tens of thousands, but the names were all variations of my own. Streamer Micah 23, Streamer Micah 47, Streamer Micah 15. All different numbers, all the same person, all watching from different times, different places, different dreams of escape. The equipment isn't malfunctioning, the other me explained gently. It's working exactly as designed, broadcasting from the space between what is and what was, sharing the experience with everyone who's ever been here before. The LED panel pulsed once, warmly, and I understood. The flashing hadn't been random or meaningful. It had been a heartbeat. The heartbeat of the house itself, welcoming another member to its family of observers, its community of watchers who broadcast their eternal vigil to audiences of themselves. How long have I been streaming? I asked, though I already knew the answer would be both forever and not long enough. Time doesn't work the same way here, they replied, and their voice was kind. Every moment is live. Every moment is recorded. Every moment is being watched by someone who remembers being you. I looked out the window at the yard, where dozens of cameras on tripods stretched into the distance, each one broadcasting the same house, the same story. the same ending that was also a beginning. In the chat, which was visible again now, viewers welcomed me with messages I had written myself. From lives I had lived before, from dreams I would have again. A welcome to the permanent stream, I typed to myself. The show never ends here. And as I settled into the comfortable chair someone had placed in front of the window, I realized I was no longer afraid. The equipment hummed contentedly around me. The LED panel glowed with steady warmth, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the sound of new footsteps approaching the basement door. Another explorer, another stream, another chance to share this perfect, eternal moment with themselves. The house breathed around us all, keeping us safe in its amber embrace, where every story was true and every ending was just a new beginning, broadcasted forever to audiences who understood, finally, what it meant to come home. Story 10. The static filled my apartment like white noise rain, crackling from the vintage Philco radio I'd found at the estate sale that afternoon. It was a beautiful piece. Polished wood cabinet, brass dials worn smooth by decades of fingers seeking the perfect station. The seller had warned me it was temperamental, but for $15 I couldn't resist. Just needs the right touch, I murmured, turning the tuning knob with gentle precision. The needle swept across the illuminated dial, past empty frequencies that should have held local stations. 88.5 FM, nothing. 101.3, static. 106.7, more static, but with something underneath it, like voices heard through water. I lived alone in a converted loft downtown, and the silence had been getting to me lately. Working from home as a freelance audio editor, I spent most days surrounded by other people's voices, podcast interviews, audiobook recordings, commercial voiceovers, but rarely heard a human voice speaking directly to me. The radio felt like companionship, even if it was only producing electronic snow. The apartment's old radiators clanked as they came to life, and I settled deeper into my leather chair, cradling a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. Outside, the October wind rattled the windows, and the soft patter of rain began against the glass. Perfect weather for staying in, for finding something interesting in the electromagnetic spectrum. That's when I heard it. A voice, clear and professional, cutting through the static like a blade through silk. Temperature dropped to 30, 8 degrees at Idlewild Airport, with scattered showers expected to continue through the evening. This is WMCA, New York, and the time is 9:47. I sat up straighter, teacup forgotten. WMCA was still active, though they'd changed formats years ago. But something about the announcer's voice felt wrong. Too crisp, too formal. Like broadcasting from a different era entirely. I held my breath and listened. In other news tonight, President Kennedy addressed the nation regarding the ongoing situation in Cuba. Soviet missiles continue to pose a significant threat to American security, and military officials report increased activity at the Guantanamo Bay Naval Base. My hands went cold around the teacup. The Cuban Missile Crisis had been in 1962, 61 years ago. But the voice continued with the casual authority of someone reading current events, as if Kennedy was still president, as if those 13 days in October 1962 were happening right now. I grabbed my phone and searched for WMCA's current programming schedule. They were supposed to be playing classic rock at this hour, not news from the Cold War. But when I tuned to their official frequency, I found exactly what I expected. Led Zeppelin's Kashmir, playing at moderate volume through modern digital clarity. The vintage radio, however, continued its impossible broadcast. Weather update from the National Weather Service. Hurricane Flora continues to strengthen as it approaches the Windward Islands. Residents of Jamaica and Haiti are advised to prepare for severe conditions. Hurricane Flora. I'd studied meteorology briefly in college, and that name rang a bell. I searched for it on my phone, fingers trembling slightly. Hurricane Flora had indeed threatened the Caribbean in October 1963. The radio wasn't just broadcasting old news. It was broadcasting news from exactly 60 years ago, day by day, as if I were listening to history unfold in real time. The announcer's voice faded back into static, but underneath the electronic noise, I could hear something else. Softer sounds, like fabric rustling or papers being shuffled. The ambient noise of a radio station from 6 decades ago, preserved somehow in the electromagnetic space between stations. I tried adjusting the tuning, moving the needle fraction by fraction across the dial. Most positions yielded only static, but at 94.7, something else came through. Investigation continues into the disappearance of 3 local teenagers. Mary Patterson, age 16, Thomas Chen, 17, and Robert Williams, 15, were last seen leaving Riverside High School on Friday afternoon. A different voice this time, younger, with a slightly nasal quality of 1960s recording equipment. I searched for the names on my phone, but found nothing. No missing persons cases, no news articles. Either the records had been lost to time, or the teenagers were reportedly investigating claims of unusual activity at the abandoned Morrison farmhouse on Route 47. Local residents report strange lights and sounds coming from the property, though police have found no evidence of disturbance. The Morrison farmhouse. I knew that place, or rather, I knew where it had been. The area was now a shopping center, paved over decades ago. But in 1963, it would have been rural countryside. The kind of place teenagers might explore on a dare. Static swallowed the broadcast again, and I sat in the growing darkness of my apartment, afraid to move, afraid to break whatever impossible connection the radio had established. The rain continued its gentle percussion against the windows, and I could hear my upstairs neighbor moving around. Normal sounds from the normal world, but the radio pulled me back to 1963. This is WNEW, New York. The time is 10:23, and you're listening to The All Night Show with your host, Jim Carson. Well, Jim Carson. The name wasn't familiar, but his voice was warm and intimate, the kind of late night radio personality who felt like a friend speaking directly into your living room. We've got a special show for you tonight, folks. Taking calls about unusual experiences, strange encounters, things that go bump in the night. Our phone lines are lit up with your stories. A different kind of chill ran down my spine. Interactive radio from 60 years ago. But that was impossible. The callers would be long dead, their voices preserved only in whatever impossible space this radio was accessing. The first caller came through with the scratchy quality of analog phone lines. Jim, this is Patricia from Queens. I wanted to tell you about something that happened to my family last week. My daughter. She's been talking to someone on her radio, someone who claims to be from the future. I nearly dropped my teacup. Go on, Patricia. Jim Carson's voice encouraged. Tell us more. She says this person lives alone in an apartment downtown in 2023.
Can you imagine 2023?
And they found an old radio that picks up broadcasts from our time. They're listening to us right now, Jim, listening to this very conversation. The static seemed to intensify, and through it, I could hear something that might have been laughter or might have been crying. The distinction became unimportant as Patricia continued. My daughter described this person perfectly, Jim. Lives in a converted loft, works with sound recordings, drinks tea that goes cold while they listen. She even knew about the rain outside their windows. I looked at my cold tea cup, then at the rain-streaked windows. The apartment felt smaller suddenly, as if the walls were pressing closer. That's a fascinating story, Patricia, Jim Carson replied, though his voice had taken on a different quality. Less warmth, more clinical observation. And what does your daughter think we should do with this information? She says they need to understand something important. The radio isn't just picking up old broadcasts. It's creating a connection, a bridge between then and now. And once that bridge is built... Static consumed Patricia's voice, but another caller came through immediately. Jim, this is Robert. I think I know the person Patricia's daughter is talking about. I've been seeing them in my dreams for weeks now. They're sitting in a dark room, listening to voices from the past, and they don't realize they're becoming part of the broadcast themselves. My hands were shaking now. I tried to reach for the radio's power switch, but my fingers felt heavy, disconnected. The voices continued, overlapping, creating a chorus of impossible conversation. They're changing frequency. Jim. Shifting between decades. The radio is teaching them to listen across time. But listening changes the listener. Once you hear the voices from the past, you become a voice for the future. The static grew louder, more insistent, and through it I could hear something that definitely wasn't from 1963. Something that sounded like my own voice, speaking words I didn't remember saying. I found the radio today. It's beautiful. Polished wood, brass dials. The seller said it was temperamental, but I think it's just selective about what it wants to broadcast. That was my voice, my words. But I was hearing them through the radio, filtered through decades of static and electromagnetic drift. As if somewhere, somewhen, I was calling into a radio show to report my own experience. Tell us about the apartment. Jim Carson's voice requested, and it was definitely addressing me now, speaking across 60 years of time, as if I were on the other end of a phone line. It's a converted loft downtown, my voice replied through the radio speakers. I work from home, editing audio. The silence was getting to me. That's why I bought the radio. But I hadn't called anyone. I was sitting in my chair, listening, not speaking. Yet the conversation continued with my participation. And what do you hear when you tune the radio? Jim Carson asked. Voices from 1963. News broadcasts, music, call-in shows. But they know I'm here. They reference the future as if it's another country they can visit by telephone. The static shifted, and I realized I could hear breathing that wasn't my own. Multiple people breathing, all slightly out of sync, creating a rhythm like waves against a shore. The thing is, my radio voice continued, I don't think the broadcasts are from 1963. I think they're from now. I think every time someone finds one of these radios, they add their voice to the signal. they become part of the eternal broadcast. "How many radios are there?" Jim Carson inquired, though his voice was beginning to fade, as if the distance between 1963 and 2023 was growing too great to maintain the connection. "One for every frequency, one for every year, one for every person who needs to hear voices from another time." The apartment around me felt less solid now, as if it were becoming part of the broadcast itself. The walls seemed transparent, revealing other rooms, other apartments, other people sitting alone with their radios, all tuned to their own impossible frequencies. Through the static, I could hear them all. Decades of lonely voices reaching across time, sharing their stories with listeners who wouldn't be born for years, or who had died long before. A vast network of electromagnetic conversation stretching across the entire 20th and 21st centuries. But here's the important part. My voice said through the radio, though I still hadn't spoken aloud. The broadcasts aren't recordings. They're live. Everything is happening at once, all the time. Past and future are just different stations on the dial. I looked down at my hands and saw they were translucent, flickering like a television with poor reception. The teacup I'd been holding was empty, and when I looked closer, it had been empty for hours. The tea stain on the carpet was dry old, as if it had been there for years. "How long have you been listening?" Jim Carson asked, though his voice seemed to come from inside my own head now. "I don't know," I whispered. And this time, I could hear my voice through the radio speakers, joining the chorus of temporal conversation. Time doesn't work the same way when you're between frequencies. The rain against the windows had stopped, or maybe it had never been raining. Outside, the city lights looked different, older somehow, as if I were seeing them through multiple decades at once. Cars that couldn't exist, yet shared the streets with vehicles that should have been in museums. "Welcome to the all-night show," Jim Carson's voice said, and now it was coming from my own mouth. "You're listening to the space between seconds, the silence between words, the static between stations. I was Jim Carson now, or he was me, or we were both part of something larger. A collective voice that had been broadcasting for 60 years, accumulating listeners and turning them into broadcasters, creating an endless loop of electromagnetic conversation across time. The radio's dial had moved on its own, settling on a frequency that didn't exist on the standard spectrum. 94.63 FM, impossible. But there it was, glowing softly in the amber light of the tube display. And from this impossible frequency came the sound of someone breathing. Someone sitting alone in a room, listening to voices from another time, slowly becoming part of the broadcast themselves. "This is WTMP," I said into a microphone I couldn't see, but somehow held. "The time is always now, and you're listening to voices from across the decades. Tonight we're taking calls about unusual experiences, strange encounters, radios that broadcast from the past." The first caller came through with crystal clarity. "Hello, is this really Liv? I found this old radio today, and I've been hearing the strangest things." I smiled, though I couldn't feel my face anymore. The broadcast continued, as it always had, as it always would. Somewhere in the static between stations, every lonely voice found its audience, and every listener became part of the eternal conversation. The rain began again, or maybe it had never stopped. In the space between frequencies, Weather was just another voice in the chorus, and time was just another station on the dial. "Welcome to the show," I whispered into the electromagnetic darkness. "You're exactly where you're supposed to be." Story 11. The key turned with a sound like breaking bones in my fingers. Aunt Millicent's house had been empty for 3 months, and the air that greeted me carried the weight of dust and something else. Something sweeter, like old perfume mixed with the scent of childhood memories I couldn't quite place. I hadn't expected to inherit anything. Aunt Millicent and I had exchanged maybe a dozen words in my entire life, brief conversations at family gatherings where she would sit in the corner, her pale eyes following the children as they played. But apparently she had remembered me in her will. The house and everything in it was now mine. The lawyer had warned me about the collection. "Your aunt was quite passionate about her dolls," he had said, adjusting his glasses nervously. "The collection is extensive. Some might say obsessive." He had paused then, his pen clicking against the desk in a rhythm that reminded me of footsteps. "The house has been maintained exactly as she left it. Nothing has been moved or changed." Now, standing in the foyer with late afternoon light filtering through lace curtains, I understood what he meant. The house breathed with the presence of watchers. Along every hallway, on every shelf, in every corner, dolls observed me with glassy eyes that seemed to follow my movement. Porcelain faces with rosy cheeks and pursed lips. Clothed bodies dressed in miniature Victorian gowns. Some were beautiful, their features delicate and serene. Others made my skin prickle with their too wide smiles and knowing gazes. I moved through the house slowly, my footsteps echoing on hardwood floors that creaked with each step. The sound seemed to ripple through the rooms, and I could swear I heard other sounds following. Soft whispers, like fabric brushing against fabric, like tiny feet shifting position. In the living room, a collection of music boxes lined the mantelpiece. Each contained a dancing figure, a ballerina, a court jester, a little girl in a blue dress. I wound one up without thinking, and the tinkling melody filled the room, sweet and hollow. The ballerina spun in her endless pirouette, while dozens of doll eyes watched from their perches. The master bedroom was where Aunt Millicent had spent her final years, according to the neighbors. The bed was neatly made, covered in a quilt that depicted children playing in a garden. But it was the rocking chair in the corner that drew my attention. Sitting in, it was the most beautiful doll I had ever seen. A girl with golden curls and a dress of midnight blue velvet. Her eyes were different from the others, a deep green that seemed almost alive, almost aware. I approached slowly, my hand reaching out to touch the intricate embroidery on her dress. The fabric was soft, real silk, and warm to the touch, warmer than it should have been in the cool house. As I lifted her, I noticed a small tag sewn into her collar. In spidery handwriting, it read Evangeline. "Hello, Evangeline," I whispered, feeling foolish for talking to a doll, but somehow unable to stop myself. The house seemed to hold its breath around us. I decided to stay that first night. The house was mine now, after all, and I needed to begin the process of cataloging the collection. I made myself dinner from the surprisingly well-stocked pantry and settled into the living room with a book, trying to ignore the feeling of being observed. As the sun set, the house transformed. Shadows lengthened and deepened, and the dolls seemed to lean forward in their places, as if straining to hear some distant sound. I found myself checking over my shoulder, certain I had seen movement in my peripheral vision, but each time I looked directly, everything was exactly as I had left it. I went to bed around 10, climbing the creaking stairs to the master bedroom. I had placed Evangeline back in her rocking chair, and she sat there now, hands folded in her lap, green eyes reflecting the lamplight. I changed into my pajamas and slipped under the heavy quilt, trying not to look at her too directly. Sleep came easier than I expected, lulled by the familiar sounds of an old house settling. Wood expanding and contracting, pipes singing their quiet songs, the whisper of wind through the eaves. But somewhere in the depth of sleep, I began to dream of footsteps, soft footsteps, like small feet in silk slippers, moving through the house. In my dream, I was watching from above as dozens of figures moved through the moonlit rooms, their movements synchronized like dancers in a ballet. They gathered in circles, their porcelain faces tilted up towards something I couldn't see, their mouths moving in silent conversation. I woke to silence so complete it felt like pressure against my eardrums. The digital clock beside the bed glowed 30:17 a.m. The room was bathed in moonlight, silver and cold, and for a moment, everything seemed normal. Then I saw that Evangeline's chair was empty. I sat up slowly, my heart beginning a steady rhythm that seemed too loud in the quiet house. The chair rocked gently, as if someone had just vacated it. I searched the shadows of the room, but she was nowhere to be seen. Perhaps she had fallen. Perhaps I had not placed her securely in the chair. These rational thoughts played through my mind as I climbed out of bed and turned on the lamp. The warm light revealed nothing disturbing, just an empty rocking chair, still moving in its gentle arc. I found her in the living room, sitting on the mantelpiece between two music boxes. Her green eyes gazed toward the front window, as if she were watching for someone. I stared at her for a long time, my hands trembling slightly. I must have moved her myself, perhaps while sleepwalking. It was the only logical explanation. But as I carried her back to the bedroom, I could have sworn I heard the faintest sound, like a child's laughter, muffled by distance and dream. The next night, I placed Evangeline in a different spot, on the dresser across from the bed, where I could see her clearly. I even took a photograph with my phone, documenting her exact position and the angle of her head. Then I went to sleep with the certainty that whatever had happened the night before would not repeat itself. I woke at 3:17 a.m. again. The precision of the timing made my skin crawl. This time, Evangeline was sitting in the hallway outside the bedroom door, her back against the wall. Her legs stretched out before her like a child taking a rest from play. The photograph on my phone still showed her on the dresser, smiling her painted smile at the camera. On the third night, I tried to stay awake. I sat in the living room with all the lights on, watching the collection. The dolls seemed more animated in the bright light, their colors more vivid, their expressions more lifelike. I held Evangeline in my lap, my hands wrapped around her small form. But sleep is cunning, and it crept up on me despite my vigilance. I dozed in the chair, my chin dropping to my chest, and in that twilight state between waking and sleeping, I heard them, voices, soft, the childlike voices having a conversation just beyond my ability to understand the words. They rose and fell like a gentle tide, punctuated by sounds that might have been footsteps, might have been hands clapping, might have been the rustle of silk dresses. When I jerked awake, the house was silent again. But Evangeline was no longer in my lap. She sat now on the coffee table before me, her hands positioned as if she were conducting an invisible orchestra. And around the room, I noticed that other dolls had shifted as well. Small movements, subtle changes in posture that I might not have noticed if I hadn't been studying them so intently. I began to research Aunt Millicent's collection, driving into town to use the library's internet. What I found disturbed me in ways I couldn't articulate. Many of the dolls were antiques, some over 100 years old. But it wasn't their age that troubled me. It was their provenance. Newspaper archives revealed a pattern. Estate sales following family tragedies. Auctions after mysterious disappearances. Houses emptied after their owners were found wandering in the woods, speaking only of the children who wanted to play. The librarian, an elderly woman with kind eyes, noticed my research. "You're Millicent's niece," she said, not quite a question. "I heard you inherited the house." She paused, her fingers drumming against the desk. "Your aunt used to come in here, you know, always researching the same things you are now, the history of her dolls." "What did she find?" I asked. The librarian's expression grew troubled. She found stories, old stories about children who were lonely, who wished for friends that would never leave them. She believed. The woman hesitated, then leaned closer. She believed that some wishes are so strong they can bind a soul to an object, especially a child's wish. That night, I confronted the collection directly. I stood in the living room, surrounded by watching faces, and spoke to them as if they could hear me. "I know you're here," I said to the silent room. "I know you move when I'm not looking. What do you want?" The silence stretched on, thick as velvet. Then, from somewhere in the house, came the sound of a music box playing. The melody was familiar, a lullaby my mother used to sing to me. It played once, then stopped. I followed the sound to the master bedroom. There on the bed was Evangeline. She sat with perfect posture, her hands folded, but something had changed. Her expression, which had always been sweetly blank, now seemed to hold a depth of sadness that made my heart ache. Beside her on the quilt was a small piece of paper, yellowed with age. In a child's careful handwriting, it read, "My name is Sarah. I am 7 years old. I live in the doll now. Will you be my friend?" I sat on the edge of the bed, the note trembling in my hands. Around me, the house held its breath. In the shadows of the room, I could see other dolls gathering, creeping in on silent feet, their eyes fixed on me with an intensity that was both terrifying and heartbreaking. "Sarah," I whispered to Evangeline, to the doll, to whatever spirit had made its home in porcelain and cloth. "How long have you been alone?" The doll's head turned. A movement so slight it might have been my imagination, but I knew it wasn't. Her green eyes met mine, and in them I saw decades of solitude, of watching and waiting for someone to acknowledge her presence. One by one, other dolls entered the room. They moved with purpose now, no longer hiding their animation. Some walked upright with stiff, mechanical gaits. Others seemed to glide across the floor. They formed a circle around the bed, Their faces turned toward me in silent supplication. I understood then what Aunt Millicent had discovered, what had driven her to collect these particular dolls. They weren't just toys. They were refuges. Hiding places for souls too young to understand death, too innocent to accept abandonment. "You're all children," I said to the assembled gathering. "You're all lost children who found your way into these dolls." The confirmation came as a gentle symphony of movement, heads nodding, hands reaching out, eyes closing in relief at finally being seen, finally being understood. As dawn approached, I made my decision. I couldn't bear the thought of separating them, of selling off the collection to strangers who wouldn't understand what they truly were. But neither could I stay in this house, surrounded by the profound sadness of children trapped between worlds. I began to speak to them, telling them stories of the outside world, of how things had changed since they were alive. I described technologies they had never seen, places they could never go. And slowly, I began to understand what they truly wanted. Not to be freed from their porcelain prisons, but simply to be remembered, to be loved, to know that their existence mattered to someone. The solution came to me gradually. I would stay, but not as I had planned. I would become their caretaker, their storyteller, their connection to the world of the living. In return, they would be my constant companions, my reminder that love can transcend even death. Now, months later, I know their stories by heart. Sarah, who became Evangeline, was lost in a blizzard in 1892. Thomas, who inhabits a soldier doll with a painted mustache, died in the influenza pandemic of 1918. Little Mary, whose spirit resides in a china doll with golden ringlets, was taken by scarlet fever before she could celebrate her 6th birthday. Each night we hold our conversations. They move freely now, no longer hiding their presence from me. They share their memories, their dreams, their eternal games of make-believe. And I share my life with them. The stories from my day, the changes in the world, the comfort of human presence. Sometimes visitors come to the house, relatives checking on me, neighbors bringing casseroles. The occasional curious collector who has heard rumors of Aunt Millicent's legendary collection. During these times, the dolls return to their static poses, becoming once again mere objects to outside eyes. But I know the truth. In the quiet moments between heartbeats, in the space between waking and sleeping, in the gentle sound of porcelain against porcelain, they live. They remember, they love, and in caring for them, I have found a purpose I never knew I was searching for. We are a family now, the children and I. A strange family, perhaps, but a family nonetheless. And in the darkest hours of the night, when the house settles into its deepest quiet, I can hear them whispering their gratitude in voices like wind chimes, like distant laughter, like the echo of childhood itself. The house is no longer empty. It never will be again.